Okay, we will go ahead and get started. If everyone can take their seats, bring your coffee. We have coffee and beverages in the back. I guess one of the downsides of having such a delicious full breakfast outside is I think people are still hanging out having breakfast, but they'll trickle in. Wanted to start by welcoming all of you to EBRI's 83rd Policy Forum. I'm Lori Lucas, President and CEO of EBRI, and I'm delighted to have you here, and I'm also delighted to take on the mantle of President and CEO of EBRI and the mission as well. And of course, our mission is to contribute to encourage, and to enhance the development of sound benefits programs and sound public policy through objective research and education. We have just a couple of housekeeping items before we get started. This session is being live streamed, and we also have internet access. You can see how to get the internet access here. And the materials will not be passed out, but you can download them by going to the EBRI website. So all of the presentations are located on our site and can be downloaded. And we also have a hashtag if you want to tweet about today's session. In the meantime, let's go ahead and get started. Oh, this is my first policy forum as EBRI's president and CEO. It is certainly not my first EBRI policy forum. My inaugural policy forum was in the early 2000s when I was the director of retirement research at Hewitt Associates. And I never at that time would have dreamed that I would be standing here in this role, but things have a way of taking an unexpected turn. For example, let's take the time I was in Thailand, and here I am. Standing between these two elephants, and I kind of thought I knew what I was in for. You can see I'm wearing a rain poncho, and I knew I was going to get wet. It was raining out. It was muddy, but the elephants seemed pretty well behaved, and I was ready to get my picture taken. What I didn't know, the information that was critical that I was missing, was the fact that my husband had given a banana to the elephant standing next to him, and the banana was very attractive to the elephant standing next to me. So that was my sudden dawning of realization as to and it's hard to appreciate from the picture the feeling you get when an elephant's trunk is about to encircle you. So it was critical information. And really again that's what EBRI is all about: information, research, facts, and providing all of this in a context that allows for very good decision making and avoids incidents like that. Today's policy forum, there's a theme that I want to put as a context for what you'll see today. And Michael Dozier of Franklin Templeton will provide the full agenda. But just to give you a taste before the Master of Ceremonies is introduced, we have a bifurcation in what we're seeing with employee benefits that we'll see in some of the presentations today. On the one hand, I'm talking to a lot of plan sponsors that are actually seeing their role become bigger, perhaps, when it comes to employee benefits. And they're thinking more broadly about financial wellness initiatives. And as, for example, millennials come into the workforce, they're thinking, these millennials have a lot of student debt. And how can I talk to them about retirement when they're where they're grappling with something much more pressing, which is student loans that they have to repay. So how do I help them and think about their financial well-being more holistically? And EBRI is actually doing some employer focus groups all around the country in which we are talking to employers about this very topic. And here's one quote from one employer that we just talked to. They said, "Every year we hear the same thing about stress and financial well-being being the biggest issue that we have. It affects people's ability to come to work every day, presenteeism, and the attitudes of employees towards their work. We understand we need to do something about financial wellness, but we really haven't started to tackle that." In this vein, some of the employers we're talking to are thinking about, outside the box about different ways of providing benefits to their employees, and we'll hear about some of that today. On the other, on the other hand, some employers and providers are clearly questioning the role of the employer in traditional benefits, such as 401k and health care plans. They note the changing role, perhaps, of the employer-employee relationship, and some in certain, especially in certain industries, are seeing it more transactional than we've seen it in the past, and in other industries, which you might term as more paternalistic. So this trend is perhaps going to be exacerbated by things like a growing gig economy, which you'll hear about today. And it's manifesting itself in interest in different types of kind of consumer-driven benefits, such as HSAs, which we'll also talk about. So as we listen and react to the presentations today at our policy forum, I ask all of us, employers, providers, policymakers, and pundits, to consider carefully not only the impact of our initiatives on our workers' financial lives, but on the employer-employee relationships of the future. What do we want them to look like? And what will be the consequences in terms of workforce productivity and ultimately a sound American economy? And again, that's really where EBRI comes in to pull all these facts and information together in meaningful analysis that could help with decision making. So think about that in today's context as well in terms of what EBRI can do to help guide this decision making. And with that, I will turn it over to our Master of Ceremonies, Michael Dozier of Franklin Templeton.
Good morning. We probably should move away from the elephant picture for me. I take that a little too personally. All right, so I'm going to run through the agenda real quick, make sure we're all in the right room for the right reasons. But before I do want to build on a comment that Lori made. We're not the only organization in Washington that helps people kind of think through policy implications, but we do believe that EBRI is very uniquely positioned to do that with the power of their analytics and their data and their research staff. So as we built today's agenda, we tried to keep in mind what are those more emerging topics that need to be looked into more deeply instead of just kind of retreading the same topics that sometimes feel like they show up for years and years without much change. So hopefully you'll feel some of that. We also made sure that any topic we put on wasn't just high-level speak, that there was some analysis done by someone somewhere on the EBRI staff, so you'll notice that each of the different segments, with the exception of our legislative panel at the end where it's just more their sharing us their thoughts and their insight, the other three are all about the topic, which I think are very unique and innovative topics, but with some really good analysis from an EBRI staff member. So that was the approach we took. So we are going to kick off by getting into this thing called the gig economy. And as we started looking at this, it was amazing. Even amongst the research committee at EBRI, I was shocked at how many different definitions there were of what the gig economy was and what it meant and how far did that reach. So a lot of this conversation today, we've done some pretty specific analysis, but I think every question on this topic is going to lead to more questions than it does answers, because every time we dig into one thing, we think of another thing, right? So I think it will be a much more big strategic view of where could benefits go, how does the whole employer system work. I'm very excited. Jake Buscalio from Prudential will moderate, Julie Steitzel, Kendra Isaacson, and Jack Vanderheyer on that panel. After that, we're going to touch on student loans. We did talk about the balance of trying to talk retirement or any other type of long-term benefit with younger employees, and how do they resonate, how does that message resonate with them when they've got student debt that's really a much more pressing matter. I think there's some urban legends in the student debt scenarios. We're going to play with some of that data and talk a little bit about it. And then we've actually got an employer, Fidelity Investments, who's done something about it. They've got a pretty innovative solution for helping their younger employees pay off student debt. So I'll lead that panel with Cindy Silva from Fidelity, Kate Wingett from Gratify, Rachel Collins from Congressman Davis's office, and Craig Copeland. And then our final panel from a thought leadership kind of policy development standpoint is the intersection of health and wealth. We will talk about the role that health savings accounts have played, are playing, some really cool analysis about how they're being used by the average saver/investor. Chris Haltmeyer from Blue Cross Blue Shield will moderate that. Doug Fisher from the ARA, Todd Berkeley from Benefit Wallet, and Paul Fronston will be on that panel. And then finally, we're going to wrap it up with a fireside chat, and we're going to have Michael Krebs hosting Chris Allen from the Committee on Senior Advisor for Benefits Committee on Finance, and Kara Getz, Chief Counsel, U.S. House of Representatives Committee on Ways and Means. Hopefully wrapped up by noon and get you out of here, okay? So hopefully you're in the right place. That's the agenda we've got for today. And let me welcome up Jake, Julie, Kendra, and Jack. Come on down. Okay.
Good morning. I'm pleased to be here with you this morning to moderate the panel on the gig economy. I'm Jake Biscaglia with Prudential Financial, and let me ask my fellow panelists to introduce themselves. We've got Jack Vanderheij.
Yes, I'm Jack Vanderheij. I'm the Research Director from EBRI.
Hi, I'm Julie Stitzel, the Managing Director for Policy and Strategic Initiatives at CTEC, which is the tech policy hub for the U.S. Chamber of Commerce.
I'm Kendra Isaacson. I'm the Senior Pensions Counsel at the Senate Help Committee for the Minority.
Thank you all very much. So we're going to talk about the gig economy. What do we know? What do we need to know? What are the implications from a policy perspective as well as from an employer perspective? I'm going to start us off with a little bit of just background that Prudential did some survey work and frame this a little bit, and then I'll ask our panelists to give some of their perspectives, and then hopefully you'll have lots of questions, and we'll make this as interactive as possible. So Prudential did a gig worker on-demand economy survey back at the end of 2017. As we think about this, one of the themes that came out of this is there really isn't a clear definition when you talk about gig worker or independent worker, and there's a lot of other labels for them. But we think about it in three segments. Gig only. Those are the individuals who that's what they do. They do gigs. They have jobs that they go from and to, but they're on their own, and that's their focus. That's how they work. That's how they earn income. Gig plus, which is more of a hybrid. They may have a full-time job and then supplement with gigs in the evening or in the morning or what have you. And then the third category is the full-time employee. So that's your traditional employees. But really three models that are out there. And the expectation, as we've seen from our own research and other research that's out there, is that this is the gig, and however you define it, is a growing and will continue to grow part of our economy. So the implications to really understanding what this is, how these individuals work, what their needs are, is becoming more and more important. A couple of things that we took out of the research is that the gig model, although there's many positive things, and that's why many folks are attracted to it, has a lot of significant challenges, most specifically around financial wellness for those individuals. From an earnings perspective, they're about 58% less in terms of earnings than full-time employees. So from a financial wellness perspective, if you're earning less than many out there, that's going to be a challenge for you. Pay, benefits, job security, all challenges as well, right? It's the inconsistency of the work for many that comes into play. But many are, there's varying degrees of what a gig looks like for somebody and the consistency of that work. On average, they're working 25 hours compared to a full-time employee who's working 40 hours. Again, so the inconsistency there. And one of the things we think is most important is lack of access to systematic programs for savings and benefits through an employer. And that's one of the challenges that these individuals have. They're on their own. They have to figure it out. They have to fund it on their own, and that's a big challenge. Their access to benefits, things like life insurance, disability insurance, very important benefits. Typically, half of them don't have access to these. So they may have health insurance, right? They have to. But some of the other benefits that are really as important, they don't have access to them. So it's not even on the radar for them. So that's a challenge as well. So when we ask them, what is the number one disadvantage to working in a gig-like model? It's really access to benefits. That's their biggest challenge that they have. So as we talk today, I think one of the things that is really important for everyone to think about is how do we think about changing that paradigm? Are there things that can be done to help these individuals get greater access to benefits? So that's sort of the starting point. That's how we're thinking about it at Prudential. We think there's a lot of needs, a lot of opportunities as well. And I think, hopefully that there's solutions that we all can think about together. I'm going to turn it to Jack.
Well, thank you, Jake. Basically, what I was asked to do was sort of set the context for how important having a gig economy is going to be in terms of overall national retirement income adequacy. And the bad news was when I started looking for data on this, the last time BLS did a survey on this was back in 2005, so at best I was looking at data that was 13 years old. Went ahead, as you're going to see, use some of the information that Prudential has, use some of the information T. Rowe Price has, to basically do a lot of sensitivity analysis. Now, that was the bad news. The worst news is, of course, now BLS just decided that they're going to release their new study next month. So what I'm going to do is basically go back after they release their survey and hopefully finalize this report. But I wanted just to hopefully give you a feel for, under various sets of assumptions, just how much the gig economy could impact overall national retirement income adequacy. And if you notice on the bottom, I'm using the same definition Jake is. All I'm going to be looking at today is the gig-only economy. I'm not looking at those people who have, quote, traditional jobs plus have gig on the side. That will be something that will be factored into the model later on. So very quickly, I'm going to give you a very quick overview of the simulation model just so you know where the numbers are coming from. There's a lot of simplifying assumptions for today's runs. I'm just going to go over the highlights of those. Spend some time with you on the sensitivity analysis, look at the results, and then give you some of the key takeaways. And if you've got the slides, I've got some appendices, including some of the information that Jake already mentioned. So if you're not familiar with the simulation model, this is something Craig Copeland and I put together in the late 90s, the retirement security projection model. It's got both an accumulation and a decumulation phase, so it's not like we're just taking people out to retirement age and comparing that with some kind of replacement ratio. Instead, we simulate retirement income or wealth to retirement age for 401k participants as well as other households ages 35 to 64. We look at DC, IRA, Social Security. The nice thing about what's going on, as you know, for the primary, the primary non-Social Security retirement wealth in this country going forward will be coming from defined contribution plans as opposed to defined benefit plans. And in conjunction with the study we do with ICI every year, we've got 401k participant behavior from individual administrative records, basically going all the way back to 1996. What we do in this particular study for today is we're looking at Social Security benefits based on current statutory benefits for the baseline. We also have sensitivity analysis where we can look at this for when the trust funds are exhausted, if you're interested in that. Now, in addition to that, once we get people up to retirement age, then we also do a decumulation phase. We simulate 1,000 alternative life paths for each household starting at 65. We have both deterministic and stochastic expenditures, so it's relatively easy to try to figure out what the likely cost for things like food, apparel, services, transportation, entertainment, housing, basic health expenditures would be, as long as you know their family status, what their income was pre-retirement, and whether or not they still have a house. We also, though, do a much deeper dive into the stochastic modeling, and this is why we do 1,000 alternative life paths, so we can look at longevity risk, we can look at post-retirement investment risk, and the one thing that seems to matter more than anything else when we look at individuals who seem to have adequate financial resources for a comfortable standard of living, but then end up falling short of money in retirement, is what their experience is with respect to long-term care costs. So the output, and this I swear will be the only definition you have to remember as we go through these slides in a couple of seconds, is we end up with something called an NRSS, a net retirement savings surplus. So you take all these households, you bifurcate them into those who do run short of money in retirement and those who don't run short of money in retirement. And for those who don't, we take the present value of simulated retirement surpluses, so basically how much wealth they have left when they pass away, and we subtract out the deficits that are accumulated by those households who run short of money. In the past, when you've seen us do these kinds of demonstrations, we focus only on the latter, only on the present value of deficits, but because that's ignoring approximately 50% of the households, those who don't run short of money in retirement, it was only a partial representation of what's going on with these individuals. So we aggregate these across all households in a cohort, and that's what I'm going to be focusing on in a second. Again, tons of assumptions. Let me just tell you some of the most onerous as we go forward. The baseline probability I have for access to employer-sponsored retirement plans for gig only is 16%, and that's something I pulled from the Prudential report. I've gone back, though, and converted that to a function of age and income, and I've also tried to do conditional probabilities to control for the fact somebody who is in a gig-only situation could have access either from previous employment or because of a spousal account. So I've run through everything I could possibly do, at least at this point in time, to control for that. The other thing that's a huge assumption is what are job change probabilities like for people in the gig economy versus the traditional workforce. Had no real good data on that. I'm assuming that's going to be part of what's going to be released by BLS next month. But at least for today, I'm assuming that based on your age and income, your probability of changing jobs in any particular year is no different if you're in the gig economy versus traditional. Again, if somebody has other assumptions they'd like to see run through that, just please let me know. It'd be very easy to factor that in. The thing that I would give anything for is an answer to the next one, though, is what's the transition matrix from gig only to full-time? When you change jobs, do you stay in the gig economy, or do you, quote, grow up and get a real job? What I'm doing today is just assuming it's a random probability that when you change jobs that you will go gig or non-gig. But there's certainly going to be a certain percentage of these people who are probably going to follow a, quote, once a gig worker, always a gig worker. And until we have some more information, I just have not been able to find any longitudinal data on this, or if there's other assumptions you'd like to see me run through on the model, I'd be more than happy to. And then the other thing, just at least to get started on this today, I'm assuming the gig economy starts in 2018. I'm not backcasting any of these individuals and just looking forward as far as how that's going to impact. So what we're doing, the next 5 slides are going to very quickly explore the impact on gig-only workers on the national retirement income adequacy measures. I'm not looking only at the gig workers themselves. What I'm trying to focus on is, given these various assumptions, given this different sensitivity analysis on what might happen with gigs going forward, or basically what is currently happening with them in terms of access or generosity of employer-provided provisions, how is that going to impact the overall national retirement income? One of the things we'll have in the full report is obviously, and this is going to wait till the BLS report is released next week, is what does the gig worker retirement income adequacy look like? So very quickly, I'm going to give you 5 slides. The first one is going to vary the probability that gig workers have access to employer-sponsored retirement plans. The second one is going to vary the total contribution rate for gig workers, which is trying to get at that fundamental question, are they having benefits as generous as the non-gig workers if they do have employer-sponsored retirement plan. Then I'm going to do 3 different slides looking at the probability of being a gig worker. Many people say that probability is going to increase in the future. How much of an impact that's going to have? The first one is going to assume that you have a total contribution rate exactly equal to traditional workers. The second one will take half of that. And the third one will assume the probability of being a gig worker doubles, but you don't have any access if you're a gig worker. So that last one is going to be, in essence, the worst case scenario I'm going to show you today. Okay, so if the first one, and I break this out by age, as you would expect, you're always going to see the biggest impact for the youngest cohorts. So the only thing I'm going to focus on in these 5 slides is the youngest cohort. We go 35 to 39 for our youngest cohort. And what I'm showing you in the red line, if I assume this access to employer-sponsored retirement plans for gig-only worker is a function of age and income, then I'm showing that compared to my overall baseline, where before we went back and flagged the gig workers, etc., there's about a 4% drop in this net retirement savings surplus. And again, remember that net retirement savings surplus is just the present value of all surpluses at the end of life minus the present value of all deficits individuals have who do run short of money. Now, if I change that from the baseline assumptions to assuming no gig workers have access, you see for the youngest workers that changes from a 4% decrease in NRSS to a 7% decrease. So there's a little bit of an impact there. The next slide looks at the impact of the total contribution rate for gig workers. Either this is a function of employers offering less generous matches or employees not making the same level of contribution, everything else equal. And if you look at that top line, the blue line of 100%, that's just the same line we had on the previous graph of a 4% drop. If you say, well, maybe it's more likely that they're only having a total contribution rate half of what the traditional workers have given the same age and income, then you have a deficit that increases to 5.6%. If you want to take this even further for the younger workers and say, no, let's assume that they're only getting 25% of a total contribution rate vis-a-vis their traditional workers, then that deficit then the NRSS ends up decreasing by 6.3% instead. Okay, now what about the probability of a gig worker? I could have done many different paths going forward. I got really lazy and say, let's just assume it doubles overnight. So we have some kind of way of benchmarking this. If you think it's going to phase out over time or phase in over time, just give me your assumptions. I'll be more than happy to run those. But again, under the current, the blue line, which you saw on the first graph of a 4% decrease, if the probability of being a gig worker doubles immediately, then the decrease in the net retirement savings surpluses basically goes more than twice of what we currently have to 8.9%. But that assumes that if you have access, you have the same contribution rate that you would have if you were a traditional worker. If you don't buy into that, then we go to the next one and say, well, what if the probability doubles, but if you do have access, your total contribution rate is only half of what it would have been if you were a traditional worker? Then we go from the 5.6% we saw on the previous graph to 11.8%. So now we're saying from an overall standpoint, these individuals, by the time they get to the end of their life, will have nearly 12% less in terms of a surplus than they would have had it not been for the gig economy. And finally, my worst case scenario, I double the probability immediately, and there is no access to employer-sponsored retirement plans for gig workers. In that case, it goes from the 7% we saw earlier all the way to 14.5%. So in the worst case scenario, we're seeing for the youngest workers almost a 15% drop in the national retirement income adequacy numbers. So what can we put together from all this as far as takeaways? At least what we've seen today, the potential impact of the gig-only economy on national retirement income adequacy is going to depend on several factors. The ones we showed you today, certainly the percentage of the workforce in the gig-only economy, the percentage of gig-only workers who have access to employer-sponsored retirement plans, and the relative generosity of the employer-sponsored retirement plans for gig-only workers relative to traditional workers. Now, we showed you a lot of percentages, didn't want to bog you down in numbers, but if you convert these to numbers, the potential dollar value of this is truly significant. In the worst case scenario I showed you, the one at the very end where we came up with that 14.5% decrease for the youngest workers, in the worst case scenario presented today, we have a decrease in the NRSS, that number I gave you in the beginning, equal to $2.2 trillion in 2018 dollars. So I take the present value from when they die, bring everything back to 2018. It's a decrease of 2.2 if probability doubles and there is no access to employer-sponsored retirement plans. If you want to look only at those who basically run short of money, it's a much smaller number, and our increase in what we call retirement savings shortfalls is about $61 billion in 2018 dollars. So I will leave it to the others to discuss basically how we try to fix this. But in terms of how big a potential problem this is going to be for national retirement income adequacy, depends on your assumptions, but certainly in the worst case scenario, the importance of a gig-only economy on national retirement income adequacy is going to be very, very large. Thank you.
Thank you, Jack. I'm going to turn it to Julie and then Kendra for some perspectives to start, and then we'll turn to questions.
Great, thanks for that. So I admittedly am not the retirement expert in the room. My colleague Aaliyah Wong is, and she also works with the Chamber. I live in the gig economy space, so our efforts or our project within the Chamber focuses on emerging tech, which range from drones to autonomous vehicles, but we recently launched a new economy, what we're calling a new economy working group in February, and it has two lines of work. One is to prepare the American workforce for the 21st century, and the second is recognizing the changing nature of work, modernizing the benefit structure. So those numbers were quite alarming. Thanks for that analysis. And it just further reiterates that there is a need to modernize the benefit structure. And that's particularly true when it comes to retirement savings. And I think the premise we're working from is there's a cost to doing nothing. And based on that previous presentation, it could be to the tune of $2.2 trillion. So there's a sense of urgency around this issue. When we talk about reforming the benefit structure, though, and this gets to the point of the complexity of the issue when you're talking about the gig economy, people talk about it in different ways. But just to level set for folks in the room, our approach is not only dealing with those folks who are in the gig economy, but also taking into account sole proprietors, micro businesses, freelance workers, people that I would classify as independents. And when we talk about reforming the benefit structure, we're not talking about replacing the existing employee-employer relationship, because it's working for a lot of people, and I'll talk more about that in a second. One of the things that we focus on within our working group, too, is just being a fierce advocate for more data in this space. To your point, the BLS survey had not been done until since 2005, and we're anxious to see the results of the survey that'll be released in a month or two. But we also think there's a need to just contribute or to continue to pound the drum for more data in this space, because you can't. The more data we have, obviously, the more evidence-based our decisions will be made. So we can't just assume certain things. It would behoove all of us to advocate for continued data. So that's another avenue of work that we work at the Chamber. And so I'll just talk to you a little bit about my experience and my conversations with the members that we work with in our new economy work, who are primarily these platforms in this space, who are trying to understand, this changing nature of work, but some of whom are traditional W-2 employer-employee relationships and might be considering entering into this 1099 gig economy workspace. And what we've seen and what we've heard is that there is an absolute desire to get at this problem from the platform space. They don't need to. But I mean, to be honest, they don't need to talk about retirement savings for the people who are using their platforms, but they care about it because, one, they want to incentivize people to use their platform. They want that opportunity or that experience to be positive, but they recognize this growing problem. I mean, after that presentation, it'd almost be negligent not to have this conversation. But I'd say the greatest obstacle for them right now is just the existing labor laws. So there's a risk that's associated with them engaging in this space. And while that's not the focus of this panel, it needs to be noted because you've got these platforms who have this desire to help the people who are using the platform, and then you've got the desire from the people who are actually using the platform to utilize the opportunities that the platforms provide. So because of these outdated labor laws, our members are hesitant to push the envelope when it comes to testing creative ideas or pilots in this space. But I will just walk through briefly a company that we work with, Uber. Some of you might have heard of it, and what they've done in this space and the approach that they are taking generally. I won't get into specifics. I'll tee that up for Kendra, who we have the privilege of working with pretty regularly. But so I'm pretty sure folks are familiar with Uber, but they partnered with a company called Betterment. How many people are familiar with Betterment? Is there anyone from Betterment here? Okay. Well, so they're an online financial advisor, essentially. So they partnered with them and afforded their drivers the opportunity to save a percentage of their earnings and then also have access to these financial advisors, not just on retirement savings, but also on a host of other things. The first year of that partnership is free for the drivers, and then the second year is offered at a discounted rate. Since Uber has been partnering with Betterment, they've seen a $3.7 million savings throughout this partnership, which roughly translates to around $2,000 per driver who is participating in the program. That said, Uber is extremely limited in going any further, or continuing to push the envelope because of the issues that I raised. Mostly around reclassification risk. They really can't do anything more than just provide a third-party integration through their app. So when we're thinking about, when we're working with Uber and also other companies within the gig economy, I would say we're at a phase right now where we're designing principles because it is very complex. But what are the principles that we can use to guide us through this conversation? And so I'll briefly walk you through some of the ones that I know Uber's thinking about, but it's also relevant for a lot of the other member companies that we're working with. So any solution that we think of has to be universal. Every worker should have the opportunity to build financial security by participating in a private retirement system. It has to be portable. So again, we're dealing with a more mobile workforce, and the benefits that you receive should not be determined by the place where you are. They should be transferable, and there should be an ease of use. They should be pooled and professionally managed. So most workers, myself included, are not investment experts, and so the research indicates that people are frequently overwhelmed by the complexity of these models, and then they experience decision paralysis. It has to be fair. So a successful retirement system should be fair to participating workers. The structure should ensure that benefits of the system are widely distributed and not concentrated among those, for example, who are just high income earners. And finally, and this is something that I covered, it needs to be minimally disruptive. So you have a system that is based on decades of work. It's working for a lot of people, and I know at the Chamber we are focused on making sure that whatever solution we have is complementing and integrated into the current system, and we're taking the things that work well, and then we're moving those into taking the things that work well and then creating additional alternatives for this new workforce. So if I had to summarize the things that we need in this space, and this is to tee up Kendra, is we obviously need more data, and so I think I reiterated that in my comments. It's something that will guide our conversations going forward. We need to provide some sort of safe harbor for these platforms that are, again, have this desire to do what's, to help the people who are using their platforms and are moving in and out of this gig economy. And then we have to figure out the appropriate role for government, for the private sector, and for individuals. This can't just be something that the government does. There's a role for everyone in that equation, and it's important that there's an appropriate balance to that end. And with that, if you don't mind, I'll tee up Kendra to talk about the specifics and all the great work she's doing on Senate Help.
Yeah, I feel like I've been teed up to have an answer, and I'm sorry to admit that Congress is not on the forefront, and we will not be solving this today. But first, before I forget, I have to give this disclaimer that my remarks are off the record and reflect my opinion and not those of my boss. So get that out of the way. So I have to say that, defining the gig economy is one of the hardest threshold questions that you can start with. So, we believe that it puts a new face on a very familiar, age-old issue of people trying to get by. You can dive into the specifics. I think gig economy right now is a catch-all for tech companies. And the workers that work for those tech companies. If we dive in, I think for us it's hard to separate or to include in one bucket people who drive versus people who offer their house versus people who sell their artisan craft goods through the internet versus, the traditional 1099 worker that everyone views. So we start with that question, which is very hard to answer. And the gig economy really is just a reflection of the growing trend of shifting risk from the employer to the employee. We've seen it happen with traditional pensions, which everyone in this room is very familiar with, and it's sort of just a reflection of more erosion of worker protections and benefits. And because I don't work in a silo and I don't just get to concentrate on retirement and have my blinders on, I also should give a disclaimer from our labor team that, there is one easy solution to solve this, and it is a classification issue. And I promise I'm not going to make this a classification discussion, but I am just going to say that the easy way to do this is these workers could be treated as employees, and then the full suite of benefits would be available to them. So putting that aside, let's get down to business. I totally agree with Julie that we need to work on a solution that covers all workers. As you know, not even all workers who have work for employers that provide retirement plans. I think we're at about 50% for employees working for employers that provide a plan. So we want to see the needle moved on coverage for everyone. So that is a really big issue. And we want to make sure all workers are fairly compensated and protected so everyone can benefit from the economic security today and tomorrow. So that's a really important thing. Saving for retirement is huge, and obviously it's my sole focus, just trying to move that needle and shrinking that retirement gap and deficit and making sure everyone has access to a plan. So we are very anxious to see the results of the contingent worker study, and then I guess the follow-up when they address the platform worker issues. So I guess they're going to come out at different times because like Julie, I think good solutions are based on good data. So I think it's really hard to sort of, shoot something out aimlessly when we aren't really sure of all the specifics around the problem. And so we also would like to see a minimally disruptive solution. So this is great. I love all of these principles. So Julie and I have talked about this before, and though we come from slightly different perspectives from the business side and the worker side, we actually do have a fair amount of common ground, and it's really fantastic. And so I appreciate our great benefits community here in DC that we can, we have often different opinions, but I think we've learned a lot from each other, and we will continue to do so because we're all going to have to work together to solve these really hard problems. And so I can talk about some of the things that we've been working on sort of under those big questions where we are not sure that we have answers. And so in trying to address the all-worker issue, we've been working on, and I've now been at like a couple panels where I keep saying I'm almost done, but I hopefully will be done with this draft soon, which I want to crowdsource. In true millennial / gig economy fashion, I would like to crowdsource to make sure, that all stakeholders think this could work. So we're taking the concept of a retirement marketplace that both New Jersey and Washington State are promoting, and we would like to scale that up to a federal level. This can help sort of take out that decision paralysis for some people and the intimidation factor when people go, a solo practitioner, a gig worker, a micro business, a freelancer, they might just be scared about just trying to figure out what works for them. So that could help sort of facilitate marrying some of the existing options to the needs for those. So we think that a marketplace could work even in states that are pursuing the secure choice auto IRA option, because those mandates start, at 20 employees. So there are still people left behind by those options. So a marketplace could help them get access and find a retirement plan. It would be lower fees. These are, at least as we're thinking about it now, this would be voluntary, so no one would be forced to join the marketplace. But we're really hopeful that this could help move the needle and help a lot of people. It doesn't solve the problem where companies wanting to do payroll deductions for their workers. But as I've noted, I have to walk a fine line between a lot of different interests, and I think this could be a really neat solution, and it's not a full solution probably, but it at least could move the needle. And then in terms of the marketplace, I think there are plans that are designed for small businesses, solos, all of those things. They currently exist, but they seem to not be working really well. People don't love them. So what can we do in that space to get better plans to those people? The open MEP concept, I think I came to EBRI last year at this, and I said, RISA will be passed, and it'll be done soon. It hasn't been done yet. I still think it'll be done soon. I'm not going to put a time limit on it now anymore. But there is bipartisan support, and there aren't that many things that have bipartisan support. So I think it stands a pretty good chance. Just finding the right time for it to happen is really one issue. And then this is just kind of a brainstorm that I've been working on, in terms of a new plan and portability. Some people think of that as in terms of the gig worker. As you can see, definitions are really hard here. But portability is also really important now, because I think there's a statistic that people change jobs on average 10 times before they're 40. And so that's a lot of, if you're so fortunate that you've had employer-provided plans, that's a lot of baggage to be carrying around if you don't roll it over, if you don't roll it into an IRA. So, how do we address that, this sort of mobile workforce that we have too? And so we've been thinking about, if I were to, come out of college and I were going to start with a gig job, if I could open up what would be an IRA type plan then, and then as I move into different employment, I carry this plan with me, and maybe it would, the limits would restrict and expand as the the type of employment I'm in change. So you could carry it kind of with you, and it could serve as an IRA type plan or a qualified plan depending on what you're working on. I don't have a lot of specifics on it, but just this general idea, I really like that you could just roll over things and have it with you, which could also help mitigate some of the missing participant issues that we also face. So if you have ideas on how to make that work and flesh that out, I'd love to talk to you, but that's something that I've been really noodling out and trying to think about how that could work. And these could be offerings through a marketplace and could really assist people as they go through their life, because while I love working in a W-2 job now in what I think will be my semi-retirement, I probably will want to freelance and consult and be my own boss and do that. So I think flexibility also is worker choice there, but we want to make sure that we aren't having a solution that hurts the workers that don't have the flexibility and the choice, mostly our low-income workers. So, I have a lot of privilege that I respect, and especially in the workforce area, that I want to make sure we are protecting our most vulnerable workers.
Thank you all for your perspectives. Hopefully there's good questions in the audience. I have questions, but I'm sure your questions would be better than mine. There are microphones in the front of the room. If anyone wants to come up and start us off with a question. Thank you.
I'm Barbara Smith of the Social Security Administration. I wondered, is there any thought given to the whole Social Security expenses?
Could everyone hear the question? I don't know if the mic was on. Can you repeat the question, please?
Yes, sir. I guess it wasn't on. I'm Barbara Smith. I'm with the Social Security Administration. My question is, what is the role for Social Security benefits in the gig economy, especially for gig-only workers? Because our benefits are portable.
It is certainly something that we think about. I don't have a good answer of how we integrate that, other than obviously classification plays a big role in how the Social Security benefits are paid for. So that's one way we think about it.
Or if you have any suggestions for how the Social Security Administration can reach out to these people and kind of inform them about, because they would be like entrepreneurs and independent workers, they'd have to contribute both for themselves and, of course, for the employer contribution too. But if we had a way of reaching out to them and just letting them know about our benefits and the importance of contributing, so that they have, and their contributions would offer them disability insurance and survivor insurance as well.
Yeah, I think Social Security is an interesting mechanism, and that's also, because we're not focusing on it, but if you're not contributing to retirement, what does that mean for Social Security? And long term, what picture are we painting, and how does it impact solvency going forward? So it's on the periphery, I think, of this conversation, but it should be a critical variable when we're talking about a solution.
Good.
Josh Gottbaum, Brookings. As we move away from the model that there is an employer and an employee, and the employer offers a traditional pension and makes all the decisions, to a world in which either there is an employee and the employee makes all the decisions, or there's no employee and you're just trying to facilitate access to some kind of financial product. Have you thought about the question of what replaces the employer's judgment in terms of making these decisions, in terms of consumer protection, in terms of either financial oversight, financial education, et cetera? Because we're clearly moving from a world in which the employers are saying, I'm not doing this anymore. But as you think about this, have you thought about by what mechanism, through what organizations, et cetera, are people given advice? Do the Washington exchanges, for example, do they provide consumer protection by the screen of letting people on, et cetera?
So using the Uber example, and I might be stepping dangerously outside of my lane, so Leah, feel free to put me back in my place. Betterment is a fiduciary, and so they provide their intent is for consumer protection, and so they do advise. They offer to advise the drivers on a host of issues, and I don't know that that's an answer, but it's an interesting relationship in that you've got the worker, the Uber partnering with Betterment, but I would say again, and folks in this room know better than I do, our efforts again are not to eliminate the traditional employer-employee relationship. It's just recognizing, and I don't know that we touched on this, the size of this workforce now, which is estimated to be closely to a fifth of the population, and where is it going? Is it growing? And again, that's why we need the data, but it's important to try to find some sort of solution so that we're just not doing anything. We're not in this deadlock where, because of classification issues, we realize what's happening now and we continue to watch that number rise, no activity, and then we're in a worse state. I don't know if you want to add.
I think that's a challenge in this environment, to be quite honest. When you untether the benefits from the employer, you're kind of in the Wild West of sorts, especially in the current state of the fiduciary rule. How do you make sure that they're getting good advice? I think the marketplace could be one helpful solution, but that's obviously only one part of the puzzle. I haven't fleshed out exactly the fiduciary responsibilities on that. However, there would at least be vetting of the institution and of the fees of sorts. So there would be at least some level of assurance when you go to this that you're not getting a terrible deal. But that is one of the harder challenges that we face here.
Thank you. We have time for one more question.
Thank you. Debbie Harrison with the National Business Group on Health. I would love to hear from Julie or Kendra or anyone else on the panel about your thoughts on ease of use. I'm a huge fan of access. I'm a huge fan of consumer protection. My organization certainly is. But we've found that a huge hurdle is simply the difficulty of rolling over, the difficulty of making your Social Security contributions if you happen to be an independent worker. And so are there products out there? And if so, and what policies do you think we could do to sort of put ease of use front and center so that when we have access, people actually avail themselves of it?
I think that's such a critical point because you're talking about people where time is probably their greatest commodity. My former life, I was at Etsy, so I was dealing with a lot of micro businesses. And if you don't have the ease of use, behaviorally, they're just not going to take advantage of it. So I don't know of companies that are currently providing ease of use or could endorse one over the other, but I think it's such a critical point, and it's under that simplicity argument. You need to be able to understand it, but you need to be able to use it because time is probably a critical factor.
I don't have a good solution other than maybe you just came up with a good business plan, so I think you could be a good person to package that.
Thank you. I'll work on it.
All right. Well, thank you to my fellow panelists. Thanks for all the good questions. And Michael, I'll turn to you.
Okay, if I can ask the student loan panel to come up, thank you. All right. While we're transitioning, I'll reintroduce the esteemed group joining me up here. We've got Cindy Silva, Head of Financial Wellness Strategy at Fidelity Investments. We've got Kate Wingett, Chief Sales Officer at Gratify. We have Rachel Collins, Counsel of Congressman Rodney Davis's office. And finally, Craig Copeland, Research Associate here at EBRI. So I won't read it word for word, but I do think it's actually pretty well spelled out in the blurb on this section on your agenda and from the website. But student debt is obviously a pressing issue facing Americans, right? There's trillion, so 1.3, 1.4 and climbing, that I think we see as an issue across the country. We've also been wrestling with it for years on the retirement side in the employer system on how you get the attention of younger workers on things like retirement when they've got other pressing issues, budgetary and debt related, staring them in the face. So this panel, a great group, we're just going to run through some data, we're going to run through some deployed solutions, we're going to run through a multitude of perspectives and just talk through what we see. I think there's some big numbers out there that we all agree on, the total number when it comes to student debt, but then when you start tearing it apart and looking at the averages and looking at the medians and the means, it tells very different stories. So we've got some data to help us out there. So I am going to actually change the slide, that would help. Let me fire through Jack's slides again here. Hold on. To this group. Okay. So with that, I think Craig, are you going up first? Are you? Yep. All right. So I'm going to hand it over to Craig. Thanks.
As Michael said, I'm going to be kind of giving an overview of student loan debt in the United States. This is going to be looked at by the family basis because the survey of consumer finances is based that way, and that gives us the best data source probably in the United States for overall wealth for American families. So I'm going to be looking at student debt. First of all, incidence, how many people have debt, the amount, the average, and the distribution of the amounts, and then I'm going to look at some payments, and then I'm going to look at some specific assets and student loan debt, meaning like retirement plan participation for those with and without student debt. So we can see that, first of all, that there has been a tremendous rise in the percentage of families that have student debt. If you go back to 2001, you see that only about 12% of families had student debt. Now it's gone up to over 22% in 2016. The percentage that actually in repayment status is a little bit lower, but it also has had pretty strong growth. This overall number really masks what's going on, though, for the young people in the country right now, because you can see that for those families that have a head younger than age 34, we're pushing toward under 35 are pushing toward 50% of them having some level of student debt. And even those 35 to 44 are getting up to 1/3 of them. So when you look at this, it certainly is a problem for the younger families, certainly that masked by the overall percentage, because when you get to the older people, 55 and older and 65 and older, it's really a small impact on these families. Although even the 55 to 64 has grown significantly since 2001. It's more than doubled from just 5% to over 12%. So you can see that certainly when you look at those young people, those people under 35, they certainly have a growing problem, and it's almost half of all of them are going to have some debt when they come into the workplace once they leave college. You could look at that. It's across all income groups. In particular, it's even actually, around a quarter of them, regardless of what income quartile you're in, except for the lowest, and most likely the lowest are less likely to have gone to college, so they're less likely to have student debt. But certainly, even at the highest income levels, we're almost up to a quarter of them having some level of student debt come to 2016. The amounts are certainly an important factor that also has gone up significantly. All of these dollar amounts are in 2016 dollars, so these are real increases in the percentage, in the dollar amounts that have gone up. You can see that the median, which is a red line, which is only the second from the bottom, you can see has gone to 19,000. So certainly the median person doesn't have a credible amount of debt. However, when you get out to the 75th and even the 90th percentile, that's where you see the people that really have a significant issue with college debt. You get almost $40,000 that they still have to pay off, and at the 90%, you're at $80,000 that they have to pay off for going forward in their working career. So what do these monthly payments would translate into? Well, at the median, it's $200. So $200 for people that have to pay a monthly amount, which is about 3% of their family income. However, when you get up to the 75th percentile, you're starting to get to 6%, and out to the 90%, you get 10% of their income that has to go just to pay for student loan debt. And certainly, even at the median, this is the amount that they may be considering to contribute to their retirement plan. 3% certainly would be, the the typical auto-enroll amount, but certainly that it becomes a choice of whether you're going to contribute more if you have to contribute this amount to pay off your student debt. If you look at overall, when you go across ages, the dollar amount is pretty much consistent across the age groups. It's about $200 overall, but you do see that it's a different amount of the percentage of income. Certainly the younger people are facing that $200 is a higher percentage of their income at 4% than it is for when you get to the older age groups where it's only down to 3%. So you can kind of see of how much they pay of their income each month to service their debt. And again, this is required debt payments. So certainly if they want to get their debt payment done earlier so they don't have to continue the full term of what they're allowed, then they're going to start doubling it into 4% and 8% and 10% if they want to get rid of that debt in a timely fashion so they can start saving for a home or whatever issues that they want to go to. Now, we kind of I want to look at this specific ownership of other assets. In two of these, I'm looking at home ownership and a DC plan where they have a positive balance in a DC plan. You can see that for the younger than 35, those with a student loan actually are more likely to have a positive DC balance than those without a student loan. And again, this is driven by those with a college debt are most likely have gone to college, that are more likely to have a better job that has access to benefits than those that without a student loan. So that there's kind of a compounding effect there, but we'll see that there is an impact later of those even if they are in a positive balance versus those with a student loan without. And you can see that this continues through each age group, that they're more likely to participate in a DC plan if they have a student loan. So, but this graph is a little complicated, but we could see that the first two bars are the younger group of each segment here. The light blue is those with a student loan, and the red is the younger people without a student loan. And then the bars of the green and the purple are the 45 to 54 with a student loan and without a student loan. So you can see that even though the people with a student loan are more likely to have a positive balance, once you get into the plan, those with a student loan, though, have a lower distribution of dollar amounts or lower balances across each of the percentiles that I'm looking at, whether you're looking at the 25th percentile balances or the median balance. You can see that it's lower for those with a student loan. So once they get in the plan, that 3% that we looked at about that required payment certainly is having an impact on their balance relative to those that don't have a student loan. The one group that really looks at the double whammy is those that have student debt but didn't get their bachelor's degree. So they went to college, but they didn't get that bachelor's degree. This is the group that really looks to be in the worst shape because they didn't get that degree, so they get that better job that gets them the benefits, that gets a higher salary. You can see that those that are young, they're 35 at college debt, but didn't get the degree, they are less likely to be participating in a defined contribution balance or have a positive balance. You can see that those without a student loan, we almost get 40% of those in this category without college, and you only get a quarter of those with a student loan. And not only are they less likely to have a positive balance, their balances are less for those with the student loans across the distribution of balances of all the people in this group. So you can see that even though we get student debt, and you can think about, you get to college and you get the benefits, certainly that is what happens. If you get the college degree and you get the better job, the student debt doesn't seem to be as big a factor on you as it is if you don't get the college degree, because then you're really going to be in worse shape. You're not going to have that better job, but you're still paying for the debt, and so you're going to be less likely to be able to prepare for retirement, and if you are able to even start paying for retirement, you're less likely to do as well as those that don't have student debt. So we can kind of see that there's been a tremendous increase in debt for those 35 and even younger than 35 and even 35 to 44. We can see the student loan debt amount has increased by 20%, and 32% at the median. But we have a required dollar amount of $200, which is about 3% of family income. However, as we get out there further, again, we see that we can get up to 10% of people's income is servicing debt at an acquired amount. But if they want to get ahead, they're certainly going to have to pay even more than that. And then for whatever we looked at, whether they had a college degree or didn't have a college degree, the DC balances are lower for those with student loans than those without. So I guess I will hand it back to Michael.
Okay. And I believe next, Cindy, we're going to share some stories about some deployment of solutions at Fidelity Investments.
Sure, thanks. So hi, I'm Cindy Silva, Head of Financial Wellness Strategy at Fidelity. And in 2015, our chairwoman, Abby Johnson, went out to all of our major sites and had meetings, manager forums. And what she was continually hearing from the managers were that they were experiencing higher than average turnover in jobs that generally had lower tenured associates, so phone reps, operations processors. And it was causing issues because those particular jobs are highly trained. In a lot of cases, they're licensed positions. So the ramp-up time to get somebody into one of those positions is pretty long, and the cost for training is pretty high. So she came back to HR and said, we've got to figure this out. So we went and we started interviewing associates who either were leaving or had left, and what we were finding on the associate side is that they were leaving, in a lot of cases, for relatively low dollars, $1,000, $2,000, not necessarily for their next best job, but because they had student loans that they needed to pay, and they were literally chasing the dollars. And so we were like, wait a minute. We've got turnover that's causing a business issue. We've got an associate problem. There's got to be a way to fix it. And as I like to say, the business case wrote itself. It couldn't have been any easier to make the pitch that if we could figure out a way to help our associates pay down their student debt quicker, we thought, create a little bit more stickiness to our associates, reduce the turnover, particularly in those groups. And so what we did is we set out to develop a program, and we released it in January of 2016. And so what Fidelity does is we make a monthly contribution of $166.67, which, when you do the math, is $2,000 a year, up to a lifetime maximum of $10,000, directly to the student loan servicer for any associates who have a loan in their own name to pay for their own education. They have to be manager level and below. They have to be U.S. based with 6 months of service and 30 hours or more, so full-time. And then the one other key, which is something we hadn't done with any other benefit, is that there is a performance component. And so as long as you are performing satisfactorily, you get to maintain your benefit. If you are what we call inconsistently performing, we suspend your benefit. And if you are inconsistent for 2 cycles, you actually lose the benefit for life. So we've been live for just over 2 years. 8,500 people total have taken advantage at any one point in time. It's usually about 6,000 or so. Generally, it's about 24,000 of our associates are eligible. So at any one point, it's about a quarter of our associates have their own student loans that Fidelity is making a benefit payment toward. In the 2 years, we have saved them about almost $23 million in principal, and we've shaved off almost 35,000 years in terms of loan repayments. So we've definitely helped our associates. We've also reduced the attrition, so we are seeing that stickiness factor. For the original population who, so say about 4,900 who have been getting the contribution all the way through, they have a 20% lower turnover rate than the other cohorts. With respect to retirement data, we couldn't do any benchmarking ahead of time because we didn't know who had student loans. But now that we do, we can compare the student loan cohort to their peers who don't have student loans. And we absolutely are seeing that on average, their deferral percentage rate is 1 full percentage below their peers. Fidelity offers a 7% dollar for dollar match. On average, anybody with a student loan is at 6%. Their peers are at 7%, but our average is 9%. So we're absolutely seeing that the group who has student loans, it is impacting their ability to save for retirement. So the quicker that we can get them out of their debt, we believe that the sooner they're going to be able to start to bump up their deferral rates. It's been highly successful. The folks who aren't getting it because they've either paid off their own loans or because they're not at a level that qualifies them, for the most part, are really excited, even though they're not able to benefit. There are a few what about me's who feel like they should have it, and it's like any other benefit that's out there. Sometimes you use it or can benefit from it, and there are other things that are out there that you can't. And so we just try to position it. It's just one of those things that, it's just not your turn. So.
That's great. Great. Thank you, Cindy. Okay, I'm sure there's plenty of questions. We'll come back around, but let's go through the rest of our panel. I'd like to hand it now to Kate Wingett from Gratify, Chief Sales Officer. You have some slides?
Let's go through. Then after. There we go. Good morning. My name is Kate Wingett. I'm the Chief Sales Officer at Gratify. Gratify is a education benefit solution platform that employers can have employer-sponsored student loan repayment. So we're here to kind of talk about the landscape of employers that are participating in programs like Fidelity's. What we're seeing in the workforce is that this is something that is, it's impacting not just the millennial generation, it is impacting almost 2/3 now of anyone between the ages of 30 up to 59. So 80% of those workers are saying that this is a significant source of stress, and employers are now engaging to see how can they help them reduce the stress. They're taking 12 to 20 hours a week just focusing on their financial well-being. And so the employers that we're talking to are looking at this beyond just getting them out of debt, but how do they also have better work efficiency? How do they have better throughput? And it's a creative solution that they can bring into the workforce to differentiate themselves as well. We're hearing the millennial term, but it's 74% of them on average say that they would leave a job within 2 to 3 years. And so how do we retain them? If you've put this investment into them, how do you keep them engaged and go beyond just that 2 or 3 year tenure mark? And what's that impact going to have on us as they turn over? And right now we're looking at stats around $30.5 billion will impact the U.S. economy through this turnover rate of the millennial generation. So thinking through the employers that we work with over 350 companies across the U.S., from the small towns to the urban coastal markets of San Francisco, Boston, New York, and they're looking at this as a solution that isn't one size fits all. They can create the budget, they can create the eligible population, they can create the target audience for this, and it's something that they're looking at, how do I meet the goals that I need, whether it be retention, attraction, key hires. It's not just something that you have to roll out to your entire eligible population. And we are seeing utilization around 25 to 30%, depending on the industry. You look at healthcare, legal, it's going to be a significantly higher participation rate, but we do see about 25 to 30% will utilize the benefit once it gets out there. And to kind of walk through some of the scenarios, let's think of a $7,500 budget that the employer allocates towards the employee. This could be an annual budget, or this could be an all-in program budget that they've allocated. So if the number one goal for the HR team is retention, they're seeing turnover in a high area, maybe it's in even kind of a difficult area that they can't recruit or they can't keep employees from. We've seen this especially in healthcare, where they want to bring them into an area that may not be the urban or attractive market. And so if we think of a target audience of millennials, you could create a plan of $7,500 that at $100 a month, it's a 6-year benefit. Stretching out the plan is something that employers look at as a way for retention. It's not just always, within the first year, you're going to get $7,500, keeping it on a long tail. The other piece that we're seeing is putting maybe an opportunity at the end of it. So $1,000 at the end of the program, or a lump sum throughout the program at the end of each year, just keeping them engaged, knowing that this is a benefit that will stretch over 5 or 6 years. The next goal we have is attraction. To the earlier point, this is not something that only impacts the millennial generation. And so when you're hiring and recruiting for mid-level managers who they also have student debt, there's something, the Parent Plus loan, where parents are also taking out debt on behalf of their children. And so to pull them from a firm where they've been maybe 10, 15 years, this is something that employers are using as an attraction piece. The employer defines the program. So we see most of our employers that we work with do offer the benefit to Parent Plus loans as well. Some are offering it to spouse loans. So, you, the employee, may not have the debt, but your spouse does. And so they want to be able to pay down the debt for anyone within the household. So this is a program that we define, which is a $200 a month benefit for 3 years. Still the $7,500 budget, but it's a shorter timeline. And also the offering to a different type of loan like Parent Plus is something that's attractive. And then this is a new piece that we are finding, especially in industries where there may be one is it's top of mind. The technology industry is looking at this as a diversity and inclusion offering that they can promote. And so looking at the disproportionate amount of debt for women and minorities, they're using this as a recruiting tool, as a retention tool, which is define a program of $100 a month benefit, which steps up over the time. So it might go from $100 to $125 to $150, depending on the year that the employee is working with them. And it's a shorter tail of 3 years, just looking at the opportunity not to take it out so long. And then the last piece that we see is competitive hire talent. So when you are in the recruiting field or staffing field, this is a differentiator. And when an employee has offer letter A or offer letter B, and there's an education benefit, student loan repayment benefit, it is attracting them. It's taking the mindset from my employer, apples to apples comparison. This is something that sets the other employer apart. I was actually talking to a staffing agency not too long ago, and he defined this as a thing, where he wanted to stress to employers, this isn't going away because now the workforce is asking for it. Okay, you've presented me with offers. What else do you have, and do you have student loan benefits as part of that offer? So it is here. We firmly believe it. We think right now there's about 500 companies around the U.S. offering this as a solution, and so there's significant room to grow. But we are looking at the opportunity from employers like Fidelity, and I want to talk through a couple unique scenarios that the companies that we're working with have publicly put out there, just to show that this isn't, again, the one-size-fits-all solution. PwC rolled this out to their associates and senior associates. So it's $100 a month up to 72 months until the person moves on to the next stage of their career. And the reason they did the 72 months was after we dove in and did a little bit of an analysis of their workforce, that was the turnover point. It was at 72 months where an associate or senior associate would move on to another firm. So they said in the time that we're training them, we're investing in them, let's also show that we're helping them with their student debt. And there's about 24,000 eligible employees across the U.S. that are participating in this program. And then we have a tech company, Peloton. Some of you may have heard of them. They have the cycling bikes, and their CEO looked at this as an opportunity to say he wanted to be like the Google of employers and the Google of benefits. And so they rolled this out to their entire employee population, including their retail locations and their delivery people. And so they said that, we want to make this open to everyone. And they have a $100 a month program as long as you're employed until your debt is paid off. So it's really a nice solution that they've offered. Honeywell, they took it into their Atlanta market where they had an innovation center that they were newly opening. And they said, how are we going to pull in top technology talent into Atlanta when they could go out to Silicon Valley, they could go to New York, they can go to all these different locations. And so they put out for new hires only $150 a month, up to $10,000 as long as they're employed with Honeywell. And so some companies say, why only new hires? Well, they knew that they needed to bring people into Atlanta from outside markets and to bring top talent into that market. This was the solution they offered. And then the last one that we had, which was something that I want to share, was an interesting way of promoting it. Connolly Partners is an ad agency in Boston. They did a $10,000 student loan benefit that they rolled out for on-campus recruiting. It's a $10,000 program that goes for 6 years. And if you're a 22, 23-year-old graduate who hears that you get your offer and it's a $10,000 student loan, they think, this is beyond what I could have expected when I know that on average I have $25,000, $30,000 in debt. And Connolly also, because they had the feedback from those employees that were already working there, what can you do for me if you're now going to on-campus recruiting for $10,000? So for the new hires, they put $1,000 loan payoff at the end of the tenure. For the current employees, they gave them a $1,000 onboarding bonus. You've already been employed here. We're going to make a one-time contribution to $1,000 a month and then tail you over the entire life of the $10,000 program. So This is unique. We work very closely with the companies because it's not just something that you have to define for the one population. You can create programs and plans that can be defined by the group that you're targeting. So wanted to just share how this is, we've got the retention, attraction, diversity, competitive talent hire, and I think we'll see more ways that employers are being creative in introducing these benefits.
That's great. All right. Thank you, Kate. All right, so now I'll turn it to Rachel Collins, counsel out of Congressman Rodney Davis's office. I think you guys have a bill out that addresses student debt, right?
Yeah. So like you said, I'm Rachel. I work for Congressman Rodney Davis. Anyone here from Illinois by chance? Yeah, a few. So his district is downstate. It stretches kind of from St. Louis to Springfield in the Champaign area. And in our district, there's about 8 four-year colleges and universities and 5 community colleges. So lots of students, lots of great institutions. And so he's definitely started playing a role in the education space and in the student loan arena. I think everyone's done a really good job of explaining how big of a problem this is becoming. Student loan, the amounts are over $1 trillion. And we're seeing a lot of really negative effects. They're not buying homes. They're not contributing fully to their retirement funds. And so what is this going to look like years down the road? How is this going to impact these individuals, but also the economy? And then also it's a strain on taxpayers. For example, according to the Institute for College Access and Success, in the year 2012 alone, you had 1.3 million students who graduated with some form of student debt. Since then, over 150,000 of them have defaulted, which means you have about $4.5 billion in default. That's a huge amount of money that's not getting paid back that they took out to the federal government. And so my boss is looking at this from multiple angles, and he realizes something has to be done. And so the Hill is looking at many different solutions. This is just one that he's put forward that we think you guys would really be interested in, because it goes along with the conversation that we're having on the panel today. You guys know more about this than I do, but as you know, many of you probably offer tuition assistance. So under the Section 127 is kind of just what it's referred to. You can offer tuition assistance up to $5,250 for your employees. The bill that my boss has put forward would just simply mirror that and would allow employers to offer up to $5,250 in student loan repayment. And then the employees would be able to take that tax-free. That's an even greater incentive that you would be able to offer, because right now, if you do offer these really great programs and that the companies are offering, the employee is still taxed on that because it's still considered taxable income. And so we have about 120 bipartisan co-sponsors on this. There's been a lot of buzz on the Hill. We are excited to see Democrats, Republicans from all sectors of the conferences coming together on this. And I'd be happy to talk with any of you about it further if you're interested in the legislation that we're pushing. It's H.R. 795. It's the Employer Participation in Student Loan Assistance Act. And you can feel free to email me if you have any questions. It's just my first dot last name, so rachel.collins@mail.house.gov. Thanks.
Great. Thank you, Rachel. Okay, let's open it up to questions. We have got about 20 minutes, 15 minutes. I've got a series of questions here, but I assume the audience will bring some forward. Please, Ken.
Thank you. I'm Ken McDonald with the Bureau of Consumer Financial Protection. We recently changed our name from the Consumer Financial Protection Bureau. My question's to Cindy and Kate. Could you go into some of the education efforts, in addition to this financial benefit, any other education efforts you're doing to help these employees and clients understand the student loan debt within the full context of their overall financial position?
So we are rolling out a new platform that's going to also offer refinancing. So we initially thought, do we start with refinancing and then go to the repayments, because would you want to be paying down the best terms that you could possibly do? And ultimately we went with the contribution first. But we think that it's really important for associates to have a broad understanding of their financial picture, but also understand where the student loans fit into that, and have a good understanding of why it's very important for them to hold up their end of the bargain. So for us, we insist, and it's part of the criteria, that they continue to make their minimum payments as well as have Fidelity's payments made directly to their servicer. And we show them on a dashboard how that's paying down their loan and getting them out of debt that much quicker and saving them interest, so that they can understand their financial picture a little bit better. We're also looking at opportunities for, not necessarily for associates who have loans, but for parents of students who are nearing college age, helping them help their student choose the best college for them, finding the right fit both from a financial perspective, but also from a future employment perspective. So for example, if somebody is intending to go to school to be a kindergarten teacher, Boston University probably isn't going to give you the ROI of what you're going to earn when you come out. So we also think that we've got to start on the front end helping the associates, but also on the tail end.
So as part of our solution that we bring to employers, we do also offer refinance services. To Cindy's point, getting them to a lower rate is a financial improvement, as well as having the employer contribution. Refinancing isn't for everyone, and so we also layer in, we have a relationship with the American Student Assistance, which is a 60-year-old nonprofit focused solely on student loans and educating the consumer on what's the best repayment program for them. So we bring that through the employers to their workforce to pick up the phone and ask someone in a one-on-one counseling session, am I in the best repayment? Is income-based repayment a better solution for me? Am I in the right deferment plan? And so in partnership with the ASA, our refinance, and then the employer pay down contribution, we look at that as kind of the student loan solution that we want employers to introduce. We are also looking ahead at how this the $1.4 trillion debt problem of student debt, and how do we plan to mitigate this in the future. So we also have a 529 college savings plan that employers can introduce to their employees to start saving for the future. And that's something that where you think about an employee who has student debt in their late 30s, early 40s, they're also planning for their child's education. And so how can the employer take an active role in that as well?
Any other questions? Lori?
Yeah, I've got a question for you, Cindy, as well. So when you started out your program, did you have success measures that you had put in place? I identified a few things you saw change, but what were the goals that initially were put in place, and how did you measure up?
We really were trying to reduce attrition, particularly in those lower tenured positions. And so first, because it was higher than the average, we wanted to at least bring it down to the average. But what we actually saw in the first year is that we not only improved it, but then it was 60% better than the cohort that didn't have the student loans. That's normalized a little bit, and it's about 20% better. So it's still a better attrition rate. So that was probably our primary focus. The other piece was attraction. So that one's a trickier one to measure, but what we were using is, what did our staffing organization tell us? And ultimately they were saying that they were getting more attention to their open requisitions. Associates had heard about Fidelity's benefit. They were excited about it. So it was really getting people to go to our website, start to apply to our jobs, and it was helping them close the deals that much quicker. I think you had made the point, when it's part of the package and it's such an anomaly, it's not healthcare, it's not retirement, which a lot of people we know when they're younger, it doesn't resonate with them. This is something that's so in the forefront to their finances. It's quite frankly one of the only pieces of their finances when they come out of school that it really resonated with them, and we were finding that is helping staffing as well.
Thank you.
Yes.
Hi, Rick Edelman of Edelman Financial Services. Cindy, I'm really curious as to the behavioral finance elements of this. Theoretically, Fidelity could have simply increased salaries by a comparable amount. By referring to it specifically as a student loan repayment program, was Fidelity able to offer a benefit that was less than it otherwise would have paid in additional salary, because you're targeting it to the mindset of a student loan repayment? And did that factor into the consideration at all?
Well, and we did. We said, okay, well, we could pay everybody $2,000, but that would be everybody. And we although we didn't know how many people had student loans, we were making the broad assumption that it probably wasn't 100% of the population. So we knew that if we just targeted this $2,000. The other piece, though, was getting them out of debt that much sooner. And so if we're making a contribution and the associate's making their contribution, it's going to get them out of debt. It's going to save them the interest. And that was the piece that we were really focused on, was helping them do that. And so some of the tools that they see on their dashboard is, this is, what it looks like if you were just making your payments, and then it layers on the Fidelity contribution, and it shows them where they're saving the interest piece of it, and shortening their duration. And that's what we were really targeting, because I think if we can get them in the right mindset of getting yourself out of debt, whatever that debt might be, and then getting the opportunities to save, that's really what we were promoting.
Aaron Shapiro, Morningstar. I was wondering if EBRI or anyone else had done any analysis on the distribution of who these benefits would go to if we choose to encourage employers to pay off student loans, because it seems to me that that's mostly going to go to the people who got a job, their investment in higher education was worthwhile, and are doing better, as opposed to the people who were saddled with debt and didn't complete their degree or got a worthless degree. So, I mean, has there been any analysis on sort of the distribution of how that would work, especially if we're sort of talking about maybe tax subsidizing this approach?
As you point out, those that have to get a job are those most likely to get these programs. So certainly that's going to be an aspect. And as I showed you, that the people that didn't finish their degree were in worse shape than those that did get their degree. So it looks like there could be some distributional issue, but there's no way that I have enough information to actually make that, overall, whether it's 80% or whether it's only 50-50. But certainly, even though if you don't get a college degree, depending upon some of the programs are actually slotted for lower level employees, so it could help them just as well if they're, depending on where they go. In one of the programs, she said it was available to everyone, so they may not have. So it's not real clear exactly how much it'd be. But as you point out, it's more likely to help those that did get the job, but I don't know what the distribution is from there.
I'll take that before you jump up. Let me take that and spin a little bit, maybe back to Kate. So in your, canvassing the marketplace, do you see a universe emerging of that, the really worst case scenario that Craig laid out, where people didn't finish their degree, still saddled with the debt? Are those people starting to show up in any way on your radar screen?
They are, and actually, I think we've kind of thought of this as the knowledge workforce would be the companies and the employers that are utilizing this benefit. We're seeing adoption in manufacturing, we're seeing adoption in retail, we're seeing adoption in hospitality, where you might see employees who did not finish their degree and they still are able to utilize these benefits. It's quickly outpacing other industries where you think this would be quick adoption, like legal and health. The other area is technology. You've heard of probably like the coding boot camps. It's not the same degree that previously people expected for the knowledge workforce, and so they're offering this to anyone that has any sort of student loan debt that is a qualified student loan, that we can process the contribution to the servicers. So it's definitely broadening, but we've seen this probably in the last 12 to 16 months.
So in a weird way, the program that Fidelity is using and other employers, Kate, you've mentioned doing something similar, are rewarding those who have saddled themselves with debt. Because if they don't have any student loan debt, then the attraction and retention bonuses that you're paying don't apply. So is there a comparable alternative that you're offering to attract those who don't have student loan debt or who aren't concerned about their student loan debt? Or is it simply so pervasive in the workforce that you are pretty much targeting everyone and it's self-correcting?
Well, I think you're right. I think there are people who were lucky enough or privileged enough or planned properly enough to come out without debt, and for them we say, some people are covered by medical plans that they don't use at all, and so it's there are benefits available that not everybody can take advantage of. What I say to those people are that they can fully take advantage of the 7% match. They can go and do tuition reimbursement, which we do allow the student loan population to do tuition reimbursement and collect the student loan benefit as well. I don't know whether or not they're in a position to be able to afford the 10% that, Fidelity, we only cover up to 90%, up to $10,000. So there are other opportunities for them that the student loan cohort just might not feel like they're ready to take advantage of yet. But I do think that it is such a prolific problem, and it's something that we just continually were hearing that we just felt like we needed to do something to help our associates.
Yeah, your data said what, Craig? 1 out of 2?
For the younger generation.
Yeah, right.
And that's her target population.
Yep.
Yeah.
And for us, I'll just add, when I looked at the data, it was a little while ago, yes, it generally looks at younger people. We were really focused on lower tenure, but we do have 10 people who are age 55 and older who have student loans that are for them in their own name. So as much as, yes, it is a younger problem, it does go across all of the demographics.
Gary?
Longitudinally, the question is, so let's just say you run this program and it happens. Do you find that it actually accelerates people's subsequent contributions into defined contribution plans? Is that part of the calculation or strategy? Or is the benefit primarily about just cash flow and retention now per the gratified place? So I'm interested in your thoughts.
I can start. So I think we're just still a little too early to see it yet. In the next year or so probably we'll have enough data to start to see that. But like I mentioned before, we are seeing that the cohort with student loans, the average contributions are lower. Fidelity fully expects and have this budgeted for our 7% match. So we don't view if somebody's not taking advantage and then they suddenly start contributing enough to get the full match, that's an objective that we're happy to meet. So it's not like, oh, we've just incurred more expense. We want to. So from that perspective, that's actually what we're looking for. We're also looking for associates to be looking in their career pathing and career mobility for the next right move for them and for what they're trying to do, and not to be constantly looking for more dollars. And so if by doing the student loan benefit we can somehow help that, yes, everyone's always looking for more money, like, let's be clear, but at least from that perspective, it gives them an opportunity not to have to do that. So that's part of it.
Patrick.
Good morning. Patrick Hayden, National League of Cities. First and foremost, I thought it was interesting, Craig, in your presentation, you didn't talk about how the federal government has a program around loan forgiveness. It would be interesting to see if there's any correlations or anything with that program, because it's almost at that tipping point. It's almost 10 years. There is some speculation whether it will continue to exist, but still, it could be interesting for you to look at. My question is to you, Kate, around this thought that you have around getting at how can we help folks save before the debt actually happens, the 529s, et cetera. So I do a lot of work on children's savings accounts. So I'm really interested to hear how employers are approaching this, or if this is something that you saw as an opportunity to come into that market, or if it was more generic. Or
It was a mix of both. The first was everyone at Gratify is working on this mission to help solve the student debt problem of the $1.4 trillion. And then we started looking at the gap of, it's about $250 billion is invested in 529s today. And then you look at what the cost of education will be here in the next 5 years, 10 years. I myself have 2 young children, and the idea that I will be paying at least $250,000 to $500,000 when they go to school, I don't know if I'm prepared for that. And employers adopted this, and the conversation was around, well, we're helping this generation get out of debt. This is a financial stress. This is something that our employees are thinking about, the idea of saving for education. So that was kind of our natural evolution into the 529 space. We are working with the program managers because the opportunity to also educate the public on what a 529 is, why do you need a 529 as part of your overall financial portfolio. There's going to be tremendous growth and opportunity there for the next few years, for the lifetime, that we're looking that this is something where an employer can bring educational benefit solutions holistically to their workforce, not just student loan pay down, not just college save up, other things that we can do as a provider.
Well, I've got one. It's kind of trying to bring Rachel back in, but I can really toss it out to anybody that has an opinion on it. So that whole notion of, bridging from just college debt to retirement savings. When we looked at RESA at one point in time, there was a kind of a 401k loan match element that was starting to surface in there. Do you guys have anything? Are you behind anything to see that resurface? And is anybody thinking more holistically about how to bridge the retirement savings and the debt pay down?
There have been some discussions on that. So our bill does not handle it that way. We go the Section 127 route, but I know there's been some conversations on the Hill. We haven't been, I don't know if there's been a bill dropped on that idea yet or not, but that has been part of the discussions.
Any other thoughts, opinions on that? Okay. Got time for one last question, if there is one. If not, we're pretty much right on track for taking a break. So I'm going to take it. No other questions. All right, so we're going to take a break. We've got about 10 to 15 minutes, and then we'll come back and talk about the intersection of health and wealth. Thanks to our panel. Final broad panel, industry-oriented panel, is the intersection of health and wealth. Chris Haltmeyer, VP Health Policy and Analysis of Blue Cross Blue Shield, will do the moderation, and members of the panel are Doug Fisher, Director of Retirement Policy, American Retirement Association, Todd Berkeley, SVP and Managing Director at Benefit Wallet, and Paul Fronston from EBRI. So I'll hand it over to Chris.
Thank you, Michael, and good morning, everyone. It's my pleasure to introduce this panel on the intersection of wealth and health. I think many of us look forward to a retirement where we'll be healthy till the end of our days, but oftentimes it doesn't turn out that way. If you look at some of the data on healthcare costs in retirement, a couple that retires at age 65 today could need more than $250,000 for health costs in retirement, and that's before considering long-term care costs. So in this panel today, we're going to start talking a little bit about how health savings accounts can play into this overall picture of savings for retirement. As was mentioned, we have a wonderful panel today to lead us through this, and we hope we have very good interaction from the audience today when we get to questions. So I'm going to turn it to Paul to go over some of the slides here.
Well, first, let's get rid of this slide. There we go. There's clearly a connection between health and wealth. We've been conducting a survey at EBRI, the Health and Workplace Benefits Survey, for a number of years, and we find this connection where, because of rising healthcare costs, a significant number of people tell us that they've been affected financially. 26% tell us that they've reduced their contributions to a retirement plan. 43% tell us that they've decreased their contributions to other savings, and you could see all the different ways in which people are affected financially because of rising healthcare costs. There are so many different aspects so many different directions that we could go as a panel in terms of this connection between health and wealth, and we're going to focus on HSAs. Maybe it's because it's one of the easiest ones to talk about. There's lots of data, lots of talk about it. And just real quick background, because I find that even after 15 years now of having HSAs around, there's still a lot of questions people have about them, and still a lot of people don't know about them. And this is just the basics. They benefit from a triple tax advantage. Money goes in tax-free, builds up tax-free, and it comes out tax-free for qualified medical expenses. There are limits in terms of how much you could put in. If you have individual coverage, $3,450 this year. If you have family coverage, $6,900 this year. And if you're 55 or older, you can make a $1,000 catch-up contribution. In order to make those contributions, you have to have a health plan with a deductible of at least $1,350 for employee-only coverage and at least $2,700 for family coverage. So this is not an account you could just open up and put money into to get this triple tax advantage. You must have a high deductible plan to put money in. So there's your connection between health insurance or health and building wealth. Today or last year, anywhere between 11% and 20% of the population in one of these plans. The numbers, they're still relatively low after 15 years, but they're increasing, though not at a very fast pace, but they are increasing. One of the advantages of an HSA is that you could use the money as a retirement savings vehicle. and we hear about that a lot. You could either pay for your expenses in retirement using this account, or you could even reimburse yourself for past healthcare expenses using this account. So you could put the money in, incur medical expenses, never touch the money 10, 15, 20 years later, save your receipts all those years, and take the money out on a tax-free basis. The money will be there for you. When it comes to how much money you could save over a number of years, if you save the maximum for 10 years for an individual, and you get a rate of return of, say, 7.5%, you'd have about $68,000 in your account. If you save the maximum for 40 years and got a 7.5% rate of return, you'd have over $1 million in your account. So there's a tremendous potential if you put the maximum in and you don't take any distributions. Clearly, how much you'll have depends upon how much you put in, how much you take out, whether you take anything out, and what your rate of return is. So there could be lots of variations. If you look at that 40-year number, instead of a 7.5 rate of return, if instead you had a 2.5% rate of return, you wouldn't have $1 million, you'd have $360. So that can make a huge difference in terms of the amount of money that's there for you after 40 years. Chris mentioned that the average couple could need more than $250,000 for healthcare expenses in retirement. It could be even more than that. If you're not average, if say you're above average and you live a long time, a couple could need as much as $370,000 for their health care costs in retirement. But please don't get the idea that, well, if I save for 40 years, I'm all set. Right? I'm all set because I'll have $1 million. Think about the fact if you're 55 today and you have 10 years to save in your HSA, you'll have, let's say, $68,000 for a couple, almost $140,000. But 10 years from now, that $370,000 is going to be higher. Right? You're always going to be chasing that savings number, and you're never going to quite catch up to it. And who knows what it's going to be for someone who starts saving today, who's 25, saving for 40 years. They may need well more than $1 million. We haven't done those projections. So we've learned some lessons about the connection between health and wealth from our HSA database. We have, as of the end of 2016, 5.5 million accounts with over $11 billion in assets. In this data set, we get information on how much money people have at the beginning of the year, what their balance is. We know their end-of-year balance. We know how much money people are putting into the account. We know how much money their employer is putting into the account. We know what the annual distributions are. We know when the account was open, and we also know whether or not there were investments. This account, it's different. A lot of people are used to FSAs, where they have access to this money that comes out of their paycheck. But FSAs aren't necessarily invested. Right? They're not invested like a 401k is. An HSA can be invested like a 401k, and we get information on the presence of those types of investments and the balances in those types of investments in the HSA database. And there's, I guess I'd say good news, bad news in terms of what we find from the HSA database. Bad news being people don't take full advantage of the benefits. Among accounts opened in 2016, the average contribution, the average individual contribution was $1,300. And as I mentioned, the maximum for 2018 was $3,450. I think in 2016 was closer to $3,300, and even higher for if you have family coverage. So average contributions in an account a little less than $1,300 in 2016 among accounts open in 2016. But in 2016, those accounts that were older, let's say been around 10 years, they saw $3,300 going into the account. So clearly, the longer somebody's had an account, the more likely they are to put more money in. Over time, they see the value of putting in higher contributions. You see the same pattern when it comes to whether or not somebody invests in something other than cash. Among accounts opened in 2016, only 1% of those accounts were investing the money in something other than cash. However, if you go back 10 years to 2006, 10% of those accounts that were opened in 2006 were investing by 2016. One of the reasons why you may see lower investment amounts in 2016 is among newer accounts is because HSA providers typically have a minimum balance requirement in order to invest, and people might not have reached that minimum balance. Often it's $1,000, sometimes $2,000. But that minimum balance requirement is below the contribution maximum. So you could easily, well, I should say easily, but you have the ability to put the money in to meet that minimum balance requirement to invest even in the first year. But clearly over time, people understand the benefits of these accounts. They're more likely to tie up the money in investments. I think one of the reasons for that is because most of the population is healthy. Think about the 80-20 rule. The 80-20 rule is that 20% of the population uses 80% of the health care, which means 80% of the population uses very little health care. And over time, well, maybe in the first year, people are hesitant to put money into investments because they're afraid of that big expense. But then they realize, well, I didn't have any big expenses this year. And I didn't have any big expenses the year before. And I probably won't have any big expenses this year. So why not start tying up the money in investments? But please don't get the wrong idea when it comes to investments that everybody who invests is saving the money for the long term. Okay, what we find is that people that invest are more likely to take a distribution than people that don't invest, and they take larger distributions when there's a distribution taken. That may be because they've built up an account balance. They feel, well, now's the right time to take a distribution, or maybe they're part of the 80% of the population that uses very little health care, but there was one year where they used a lot of health care because something came along and decided to take advantage of the distribution then. And investments aren't necessarily tied up. It may take a day or two to sell it and to get the distribution to cover the expense. But I think the fear is more along the lines of maybe this investment will be worth less than what I paid for it, and people are hesitant to sell at a loss. And finally, investments make a big difference when it comes to balances. Among accounts opened in 2016, those that didn't invest had an average balance at the end of the year of $970. However, among those that did invest, they had a balance of $5,200. That's not necessarily because they saw a tremendous rate of return on their investment in 2016. Chances are they didn't put the entire contribution in on January 1st. Maybe some did. Chances are they didn't. What's likely going on here is those that invest right away are putting in a lot more money to begin with, which is why they have higher account balances in that first year. But if you look over time, say go back another 10 years to those accounts opened in 2006, in 2016, those accounts with investments had over $27,000 in them, almost $28,000, whereas those that didn't invest only had $6,700. So investing obviously can make a huge impact on account balances. So conclusions, rising healthcare costs affect other finances. HSAs could be used as a retirement savings vehicle. You're never going to catch up to that dollar amount you need to save for your healthcare expenses in retirement, but that's mainly because of the caps on how much you can contribute to the HSA. You're limited statutorily, and that's just the way it is right now. And therefore, HSAs, they're not sufficient to save for healthcare in retirement. Something else, you have to find another savings vehicle if you want to cover those expenses by the time you're 65. Individuals do not take full advantage of HSA features, but over time they seem to be moving in the right direction. There's this question of are they moving there fast enough or not, but there's certainly movement in that direction. So I'll end there and turn it over to Todd.
Thanks, Paul. We're very grateful to EBRI as an industry for the great research you do, and it really is helpful to have some fact-based information. Unfortunately, a lot of what the facts show is what breaks my heart, having been in this business for a long time. And I'm a true believer, you'll see as we proceed on the panel, that I really think this is a very, very important part of our economy, and one that's strongly underutilized. The biggest problem is that it's confusing. We're right at the intersection of health and wealth, and people don't understand either one, much less how it all comes together. And so I'd actually, before I joined Conduent, I run the Benefit Wallet business. We're one of the largest HSA providers in the country. We also offer the FSAs and HRAs and other kinds of accounts. But I ran another program for a number of years, so I've been in this actively engaged in managing these kinds of accounts since 2005, and before that, many years in the banking industry trying to get people to save and invest. And so I've been in this space for a long, long time. I wrote a book. It's a fascinating read if you haven't picked it up. It's called the HSA Owner's Manual, and if you're having trouble sleeping, Chapter 6 will put you right down. I mean, 5 minutes and you'll be out. But it's a sad commentary that you can write a 200-page book about how these things work, right? So we're driven by healthcare rules, we're driven by IRS rules, and if you think about how most people are introduced to an HSA, it's this really bad open enrollment meeting that says, remember that Cadillac health plan that we used to have? Gone. We now have a high deductible health plan. And so most people, it's like, oh my gosh, what am I losing? How is this high deductible going to work? These high deductibles back in 2005 were shockingly high. Over the course of time, they've become very commonplace. I think the average health plan, average PPO in America probably qualifies for an HSA. It's right at that level right now, whereas in the early days, it's like, oh my gosh, how could I ever live with a deductible of that type? So most people are kind of dragged in against their will. They're much more focused on whether they're going to lose their doctor or how things are going to work, and everyone imagines that every boy in America is going to break their arm in January, right? Because they get really nervous about what's going to happen before you build up that money. And so you're not necessarily really ready to think about how this would play into my retirement, And so also, are you necessarily hearing about this from your financial advisor? Not really. The investment firms have been slow to come into this space. There have been a couple that have been playing for a long time. A couple of them are really starting to make some hay, and so I think there is a new opportunity to get the financial advisors and investment firms involved in this. But it's a complicated little account, and so that's kind of helped people out. And plus, the way that most of the major providers offer investments is in a self-contained system inside of the HSA structure, and it's hard for that advisor to make money, because and even some cases they're barred from giving advice on which fund you should pick because they don't own those assets, and it's not part of the assets under management. There are some new things coming out that are allowing those advisors to participate. I think there's a huge surge of interest that could happen in that space. We're looking at partnering. We've often partnered with health plans to offer the HSA. We could easily partner with investment firms to make it easy for them to offer accounts and make it easy for their advisors to participate in this as well. But part of it is that low contribution amount, and so every one of those health bills that didn't pass last year had a provision to roughly double the amount that you could put into the account to the out-of-pocket maximum, which I think makes sense, around $13,000 or so, which would make a big difference in terms of people starting to really think about this as a retirement plan. So how do I change my, there we go. So let's just talk a little bit about the basics, because as I said, people, what I find is that they are so overwhelmed, usually when the idea is first introduced, they either have a bunch of options and they just want to stick with the one they've got. There's a natural, I think people would rather go to the dentist than go through open enrollment. It's just, people just, for whatever reason, don't spend as little time as possible on choosing which health plan. Plus, it's complicated. In many, many cases, if you were able to do the math and really understand your average health costs, because 80% of the people use so little health care, I think most people would find they would be better off just on that health plan calculation if they had confidence in that math. But when you add the tax savings into that mix, we think even at today's low contribution levels, the average HSA account holder saves about $25 to $40 a month, depending on their income and tax break. But if you're a couple in the highest tax category and age 55 plus, where you can put in $8,900, So $8,900, that's not nothing, in terms of catching up for your health care costs. That could be a savings of $300, $350 a month. And so if you factor that into the math on the health plan, I think a lot of people would be much better off in a high deductible health plan, send less money to the health insurance company, put more of that premium savings into your account, and now you have control over those dollars when you spend them and how you spend them. And you can invest in the years when you don't have the healthcare expenses and save for a time when you do have. So if we just kind of review the basic facts, tax-free deposits, Paul mentioned triple tax-free. I would say it's actually even quadruple tax-free. So you get the tax break when you put the money in. You can only put the money in when you have the right kind of health insurance coverage. But once that money is in the account, you have the rest of your life to spend it. And most people don't realize that. The rules for taking money out are completely different from the rules for putting money in. And so you've got the immediate tax break. It grows tax-free, so the extent that you earn interest and or investment earnings, that's all tax-free. And as long as it comes out on medical expense, it's fully tax-free at the time that you take the money out. And you have the rest of your life. You can give your account to your spouse as an HSA after you die. It just becomes part of your estate if you give it to somebody else. But the fourth tax savings is a very important one for employers and for individuals, and that is the FICA tax savings. So if you run the contribution through payroll, which is really the only way Americans save, is if it goes out of their paycheck before it lands in the bank. There's another 7.65% tax break for both the employer and for the employee. So the money that your employees are putting in to their accounts is often, the tax savings for the employer is often enough to more than cover the costs of offering the HSA account for your employees because you have that tax savings based on their contributions. Tax-free withdrawals, the rest of your life to spend as long as it's on that list, and at today's levels, most people are not going to have enough in their account to cover their out-of-pocket expenses. So I'll put it this way, if you're saving money in your 401k or in your IRA for future health care costs, which by the way are probably blowing up your financial plan if you're not looking at it carefully, you are not maximizing that savings because you're going to pay tax on that amount when it comes out that you could totally avoid if you had it in an HSA. I've got a slide here coming up. I'll show you. It's just a no-brainer. This is the best tax break in the entire IRS code. No doubt about it. So if you've got people that are saving in their 401k for healthcare expenses, they would be much, much better off saving inside the HSA. The funds never expire. So there is, and that's another thing what I find is a lot of people confuse this with the FSA, which is much more prevalent, has been around longer. And so we actually have a lot of people that still rush to spend their money out of their HSA for the end of the year because they think that it's going to go away. It's not going to go away. That money stays in there forever, so it gives you lots of options in terms of when you decide to take those distributions. And we see about 25% of the accounts don't take any money out of their account in any given year. Some of those people don't have any medical expenses to take it out for, but we know there's lots of people who save deliberately in their HSA, and they're saving those receipts, and someday they're going to take that money out, either for cash. You can, once you've, I mean, you can, when you have an expense that you pay out of your own pocket, you can take that distribution right now, or you can wait 10 years, or you can wait 40 years to take that out. And you can pile that up and use that money for any purpose. I think most people are now legitimately afraid of the growing amount of healthcare costs, and so they might have the ability to take out and spend it on something else, but they're probably going to double use it and have it there available for their medical expense in retirement. Family friendly. So the rules on taking money out is for anyone in your family, anyone that's your tax dependent, your spouse, yourself, any tax dependents at the time of the expense. Has absolutely nothing to do with how they're covered. The timing is totally up to you. So to put money in, you have to have the right kind of health care. To take the money out, totally independent of health care coverage. It's all about your spouse, yourself, or your tax dependents at the time of the expense. And then it's also fully portable. So this is truly your money. When you leave your company, you take this money with you. So an employer, the one thing we recommend to our employers is you can take some of that premium savings and put it into the account for the employee, especially in the early years, to get those accounts seeded, to get them funded, to show that you're on the same page, that this is something you're doing together. We think there's a great amount of behavior change that happens when you spend your own money versus spending someone else's money. It's just a fundamental difference, and you start asking different questions. You start thinking about, you start calling that nurse line that you never called before. You know, it really is amazing the amount of change that happens just naturally, even in the lack of education and or engagement into the education. But it's your money, so when you put that money in, it's like putting money into a paycheck. That individual has full freedom to spend that money for the right things or the wrong things. We see very little actually of them spending on the wrong things because everyone knows they really are going to have medical expenses down the road. So here's the chart on the tax savings. So clearly money grows, you know, the contributions are tax deductible in both an IRA, 401k environment and in an HSA. The money grows tax deferred. That's exactly the same. There's a penalty if the money comes out. The penalties are calculated slightly differently, but it's basically, our penalty is actually a little bit higher. That went up with the Obamacare law to a 20% penalty. At age 65, that penalty goes away, however. So you can use your money tax-free at any age for anything on the medical expense list. So it's the same list that we use for deducting medical expenses or the FSAs and HRAs. They all go off of that same IRS 213D list. But before age 65, one difference is you can use your money if you are unemployed. If you're receiving unemployment insurance, if you're on COBRA, or also for long-term care insurance. That is a eligible expense for HSA at any age. Once you hit 65, premiums now come into play. So you can pay Medicare premiums out of your HSA at age 65, and that penalty drops off as well. So in the unlikely event that you've got too much in your HSA and not enough medical expense, you can still take that money out and pay the exact same tax as you would take coming out of an IRA or 401k. So the laws are, the tax law is better in every single way, and there's no required minimum distribution or means testing. So in that case, you actually have better rules with which to withdraw the money. You decide when you take it out. You don't have to start taking it out at age 70 and a half. Most people are not thinking of it, but because it's usually introduced as part of my health plan, usually as part of bad news in my health plan, they tend to lock into it and think about putting 500 in, taking 500 out, putting 500 in, taking 500 out. So a lot of what we are doing as an industry and Benefit Wallet in particular, because of our focus on education, because of the fact that we have long been part of a consulting firm that believes in helping people understand how this stuff works, we are just doing more and more customized communications. We think the time to learn is all the time in lots of different ways, but a lot of our communication is happening at the point of a targeted action. You just turned 55. Did you know you can put an extra $1,000 in? We saw your balance just went down to zero. Did you know that you can put money in again? Unlike the FSA, it's not a once-a-year annual election. I can change my payroll at any time. So a lot of people will put in too little, get a big bill, and don't realize that they can put that money right in and take it right back out of their HSA, and the government just paid for 25% of that bill. I mean, it really is a fabulous vehicle. It's just so complicated, and there's so many aspects of it that many people don't realize it. And so we're finding real value in just doing this kind of trigger-based marketing or generational-based marketing. Millennials are thinking about this very differently than the 55-plus age group. High-income people think about it differently than low-income people. And frankly, we've been very disappointed in the high-income people, because we often get the knock that this is just a tax break for the rich. I think the average 100,000 household puts only like $1,300 or $1,500 in their account. I don't know if you have that in your research, but it's not. They're not maxing it out. They often are not taking the time to look at it. Whereas lower income people, it's often the first time they've ever had a savings account because their employer is putting that money in for them. And that can be very empowering for a low-income person to have $500 sitting in a savings account that they decide how to use it. That's going to go with them if they leave the company. We've had actually much better engagement on the low-income side of the scale than we have on the high-income side of the scale. And then finally, another area that we are really starting to differentiate and see some really good value is with some of our larger employers. We're coming alongside them with a marketing team that says, let's look at your population. Let's send the right messages to the low-income people, to the high-income people, to the union population, to those that are displaying this kind of behavior or that kind of behavior. We can do the analysis, and we can help do all the work, and then let that employer send these messages, which is much more valuable than us sending the message, because they may or may not know who Benefit Wallet is or who Conduent is. And so there's just lots of activity going on in the education front, where we think there's lots of value to open people's eyes, because like Paul said, when you start investing, to me that's a real proxy for, I had not thought about it this way. It's amazing how people don't know that they could even invest inside their HSA. But once you get there, you start thinking about it differently, and that's good for everyone. It's good for the employee. They get more value. They get more savings to cover this cost that's coming their way. They're more satisfied with the benefit that the employer is providing. And it's good for me, because accounts are more profitable when they're using the card more, when they're putting more money into the account. And so I can invest more back into that education program. So it's truly one of these areas where it's really good for everyone to help with this education, and mostly for that account holder who's going to get more value and really unlock what's a very, very powerful but very complicated little account. So with that, I'll turn it over to Doug.
Thank you, Todd. I think back, the fact that Todd held this book up and said, there's enough in this thing to write a book. And that brought me back to 1996. We were at the table, it was morning, and we had Trent Lott, Newt Gingrich, Bill Archer, Ken Keyes, and we sit there and we cut the deal on the MSA. We did it on the back of a 8.5 by 11 envelope. And the reason why we can write a big book about it is because it was designed to fail. And back when it was the medical savings account. And then in the Drug Act, 2003, Bill Thomas fixed it and made it what it is today. So what I'm going to do now then is build on that. And I'm going to ask, this is the audience participation part. Because when we were putting this panel together, I said I'd like to come up with a handful of questions. These are sort of my observations and musings working with a large 401k and a smaller HSA provider for almost 20 years, looking at the data and analytics in relation to the provision of other benefits, especially 401k benefits. And I don't have the answer to these questions, but those of you that are in the benefit consulting area,
if you're going to walk, can I have you?
Sometimes I do walk, yes.
And that's good, but we need to pick it up for the audience.
Okay, yeah, so sometimes, so when I'm thinking about these questions, if you're a plan sponsor, we would love to have your point of view and how HSAs do or do not work for your workforce. Or if you're a benefit consultant, what are you doing to integrate that? And if you're a financial advisor, I see at least one here that would, is the advisory community building these things into the advice model because there is an investment component to it. So here's my first question. Paul said the rate of growth of HSAs is slowing. And participation is relatively flat. Now, think about participation in the 401k plan now. It's been relatively flat for how many years? About 40 years. I mean, auto enrollment in 96 made a big jump. That's the last jump we had, small jump. But is that where we are in the HSA? The people that are going to have HSAs, do they have them now? That's a question. Anybody have an idea here? No? No idea. Gut reaction. Okay. So, need more coffee?
I think there's lots of upside myself. I think we've seen a steady growth in the number of people covered, but we've never seen that hockey stick that we've been predicting year after year after year.
And why is that, Todd? What is it? Just health plan adoption?
I think a lot of it has to do with the health plans, and I think what we're seeing today is that as the deductibles have skyrocketed in the last few years, that there's lots of high deductible health plans that are not an official IRS high deductible health plan for HSA purposes, because they include a drug plan or they include an on-site clinic or some other thing that disqualifies that high deductible plan from actually participating in the HSA.
And Paul, you have a comment?
Yeah, there's a couple other reasons, but one of them is large employers that offer HSA plans typically offer it as a choice.
It's not full replacement.
Not everybody takes it, right? Whereas if they're offering a 401k, is everybody in the plan? Everyone's in the 401k plan. You don't see that with the HSA plan when it's offered.
Yeah. Now, here's an idea that I've been talking, those of you who know Roy Rantham, Mr. HSA. Roy and I worked on staff together in '96. And he said, why don't we auto-enroll in the HSA? Is that the next evolution of HSA? So who here is an employer? Raise your hand if you're an employer and offer an HSA. Can I just ask you? Okay, I need somebody that's an employer that offers an HSA. I know somebody here does. Yes. So are you auto-enrolling, or have you thought about auto-enrolling into the plan?
In our format, we can't auto-enroll.
You can't. Yeah. But would you consider it if you, could?
Auto-enroll into the HSA?
Yeah, so people that elect the HSA, there's a lot of unfunded accounts. I think 20% of accounts are unfunded. And they're not saving at the right rate, because they need to cover their out-of-pocket deductible. I would say for a lot of people that's a more important savings on the hierarchy of savings to fund the HSA, irregardless of the triple tax benefit. I'm talking about in terms of security for their family.
It's a reasonable question.
Yeah. So that's an idea we're looking at. So let me go to the next question. So when I was at this larger firm, the marketing department said, let's position HSAs as a supplemental retirement plan. Sounds reasonable. Todd talked about the triple tax efficiency, more efficient than the 401k. But then we had employers pushing back on us, saying people need the money for health care. So I don't want you to position it. Not all of them, but some of them said, I want to position it that way. So can HSAs really become a viable supplemental retirement vehicle for most people? Given the limited resources, knowing that all benefits dollars come out of the paycheck? I don't know. Comment? We got a comment back there? So that's another question that I ponder is it reasonable, other than the highest paid people in the company, is it reasonable to position them that way? I don't know. We kind of hope we could. And maybe as an advisor, you do that for some people that can afford not to spend their account, like me. My third question is, are HSAs competing with other benefit dollars? So, of course they are. So I've had this sort of notion, if you step back from the benefit system in general, and you think about where do your benefits come from? All of your benefits ultimately come from your paycheck. It's just that the employer creates a fiction to hire you and says, I'm going to buy some health care for you. I'm going to buy some disability. I'm going to buy some short-term disability, some long-term disability. I'm going to pay for part of your health plan. And I'm going to have a 401k, and I'm going to have a big match. So and we, as employers, we've sold that as come to my company because, and I have a student loan program now, which I thought was fascinating. You think about it. When you go to work, your employer is budgeting you at a 1.4, right? 1.4%. That 0.4, if you receive no benefits, should theoretically be in your pay, but it goes to benefits. So you think about, is it reasonable to say, can people save more in the health savings account or the 401k? When healthcare is it sounds like healthcare and student loans are growing faster than wages in the paycheck. So one of the ideas is, and either this is a really dumb and stupid idea, or it's just out there so far people haven't haven't figured it out, is how do we make relative important benefits more affordable given the same amount of dollars people have to spend on them? It's not a trick question. My theory is when the benefit sellers and providers walk into a plan sponsor, and I saw this all the time when I would meet on retirement benefits for plan sponsors and HSAs, the 401k people would walk in that door because that's what they made the most money on, selling 401ks. The healthcare people came in a different door on a different day. The disability came in, short-term and long-term. They usually came together, but they came in on a different day. And one of my favorite stories, I was with a large defense contractor, and I looked at this long table, about this long, and had these gigantic notebooks on it. I said, what's all this? And one notebook was that tall. He goes, that's healthcare, because that's where we spend all our money, a lot of money. And then the next one had some insurance and health, disability, disability. And then the 401k was here, where Todd is, or he's the HSA guy, so it was here. And the 401k was about here. And the notebooks were smaller and smaller and smaller, and that kind of where they put their attention. It's kind of symbolic of what was going on. So about a year ago, I said to Jack Vanderhuysen, he's hiding in the corner over here, I said, Jack, just off the top of your head, what is the relative inefficiency on voluntary and non-voluntary benefits in the workplace? Because what we largely do is employers buy a certain amount of benefits for you, say Megan here, my friend. Megan, you get this. Whether you need it or not, that has a cost. Then I need you to fund the 401k, and I need you to fund the HSA. And if the 401k is favored, you put more of your money in there, but maybe you should do it in the HSA. And maybe you're buying too much health care and not enough retirement, or maybe you're buying too much disability when you don't need it anymore. Maybe you're 60 years old, working for the company, near retirement, you don't need disability anymore. Or maybe you don't life insurance because you don't have kids. So the idea here is, and maybe this is an employer, probably a provider and employer. I think if employers said to providers, said, you guys need to get together in a room and figure out the most efficient benefit structure for Jeffrey here, or for Doug Fisher, or for Mike Dozier, or Paul, and figure out what I need at this time, given a limited amount of IPQ. Give me a set of questions to figure it out. And then you create this perhaps more efficient benefit structure for people, and just maybe you can get them to find those, I call them, the coins in the couch, to help them fund other benefits. But the HSA is prominent because we're just walking in and pounding on people saying, spend more on your HSA, you need it. Now I need you to spend more on your 401k, and I don't think people can obviously do that. And then the last question, and I asked Roy this question because I had Roy take a look at my slide. I said, and I know people have a gut reaction. So Jennifer, I'm going to ask you because I know you're at the ABA and you know this stuff. You're just being modest over there sitting here. Do employees have the information and skills to use HSAs and other benefits more efficiently and effectively?
I definitely think that's something we could improve on as a in terms of education and that sort of thing to employers and to employees. I think that there's definitely a lack.
Yeah, and Jennifer, thank you. I agree with that. Because, and you can see this evolving in the marketplace, some providers are saying, fill up your here's the question. What provider in the marketplace that's on your platform as a plan sponsor is saying fill the HSA first? Fill it all the way up to your out-of-pocket deductible. And then are they saying to you, then go to where? The match. Grab the match. That's free money. If you're a 401k provider, you're saying go fill the 401k. If you're an HSA provider, go fill that first. Because the third step, if you're thinking about tax efficiency, and I'm talking about need in tax efficiency, financial security, which is probably more important than tax efficiency for most people, even though tax efficiency means dollars, extra benefit dollars. Where do you go with your third dollar? Megan, you know the answer to this. You go back to the HSA, but how many providers are saying that to your participants? And if you're a 401k provider, you don't like that because then the fourth step is then if you have anything left, you go back to the K plan. When really what you're doing is, if you're on a pure tax efficiency, and imagine putting in a need basis on top of that. I mean, you think about your financial advisor. If we had the fiduciary rule, and you were giving investment advice on how much to save and how much to invest in the HSA and 401k, you'd have to do that. Ask those questions. So anyway, that's my 2 cents to leave you thinking about this. And let me hand it to Chris.
Thank you. Excellent presentations. So why don't we turn to questions from the audience? Yes, please. Oh, yes, sure. Yes.
Is it realistic to think that the great tax benefits are going to last? So with the government looking for money everywhere, isn't it reasonable that these could be a victim of their own success?
Mark, you want to answer that? Mark EBRI? we drafted the HSA when Mark was on vacation, by the way.
Well, you drafted the
MSA when you were on holiday.
At Treasury, and as you recall, Doug, I then got Teddy Kennedy all concerned about the policy. We defeated the MSA in the Senate. You got it finally passed, and as you said, finally Bill Thomas in 2003 realized your vision and gold rule insurance companies.
Thank you.
Vision, more importantly, better. But I would actually say yes. I think you can count on the tax benefits generally continuing, and frankly, because you and Mr. Archer and the leadership at the time did invest a huge amount of political capital and thought in this, and because there is some intellectual justification, even though many of us have our policy concerns, but it does make people potentially more cost conscious. I think the tax benefits generally will continue, and that it's reasonable to count on them. What I would add, or be interested in your talking about, Doug, because I think I love your general approach, of sort of integrating all the benefit calculations and looking to what we can do to help people make good decisions. Don't you want to integrate the debt? I mean, what comes before the HSA and before your second order, fill up the K till the match comes, get rid of your payday loans.
Yes.
And then maybe simultaneously with contributing to the 401k or HSA in the first instance, get rid of your credit card debt, or other high-cost debt. Do you integrate those in there?
Yeah. So Mark, your comment is spot on. I mean, I can even go back one step. So the answer is the firms have not even integrated the savings-oriented benefits like HSAs and Ks. They certainly haven't integrated the optimal allocation of other benefits like on the elevator the other day with a friend of mine who's worth $100 million, and the employer he's still paying $400 a month for disability. Or I don't have kids, and I'm 50 years old. I'm being generous with that number, and I don't need life insurance. But could I take that and put it in for my health care in retirement? Yeah, I'd like that. Those are the things. So, Mark, I could even go one step further and help people set up bank accounts, the unbanked, then the credit card debt. Yes, yes.
So I think we have time for one more question.
So this is more of a HSA owner's manual question for Todd. So can the HSA funds be used for Medicare insurance payments, Part B or Part D? And if so, are there any existing functionalities for people to use it that way that helps people to use it for Medicare insurance premiums?
For the premiums? Yeah, absolutely. So at age 65, Medicare premiums, everything except Medigap. And that was a Bill Archer thing, because if you think of Medigap, it takes away your deductible. So that's kind of anti-HSA. So any premium other than the supplemental Medicaid, Medicare can be paid after the account holder hits age 65. Up until then, it's only for healthcare insurance premiums from COBRA or while you're actively receiving unemployment, and long-term care insurance premiums are always eligible. So basically, at the day you turn 65, Medicare premiums are added to the list of the eligible expenses.
Great. Well, please join me in thanking this panel for the excellent presentations. I'll turn it back to Michael.
Okay, moving to our final agenda item of the day. I see our guests are here, so if you guys want to start to make your way to the front, I will do a quick introduction, but then I'll hand it over to our host. So our host of our final session, we're going to spend a half an hour talking about congressional staff perspectives from both sides of the aisle. Coming up to host the conversation, Michael Krebs, principal of Groom Law Group, and participating in the conversation will be Chris Allen, Senior Advisor for Benefits Committee on Finance, and Kara Getz, Chief Counsel at the U.S. House of Representatives Committee on Ways and Means. I'll hand it over. Michael, thank you.
Thank you. Well, thanks, everybody. We're very lucky to have Chris and Kara. We yanked them away from all the commotion on the Hill. It's a busy time, as folks know, and they're both experts in this field. As Michael said, Kara is with... Can you hear me now? That was intentional, so you didn't have to listen to me. Kara is with Mr. Neal over on the Ways and Means Committee. He's ranking member there. And Chris, of course, as Michael mentioned, is with Senator Hatch in the Finance Committee. So they're both two experts in the retirement space, have a lot of insight to share. So we're going to cover a few topics today. We'll run through a few topics. I want to give their disclaimer so they don't have to. Everything they say should be considered off the record, and the opinions they express are not those of their bosses, but of their own. Otherwise, you have to hear that twice. So let's go ahead and get started. We've got it's been a...
But hopefully well informed, but you have to figure out which is which.
Yeah, right. So it's been a very busy year on the Hill, and oddly enough, this year, for the first time in a long time, I think retirement has taken a pretty major role in the policy discussion in both the House and the Senate. It's actually pretty amazing. It's the first time in a long time where we've had that. So I want to tick through and discuss a few of the core issues. The one I think we've got to start with, let's just get it out of the way because I know it's the most challenging for everybody, has to do with the multi-employer pension system. As folks in this room probably are aware, this is, from a congressional perspective, this is probably the number one driver of a lot of members in Congress. We have there is a minority of multi-employer plans that are seriously distressed. As some of those, including some very large ones, go insolvent in the near future in pension terms, they will tax the PBGC's ability to pay the guaranteed benefits or provide financial assistance to pay those benefits. And at the end of the day, PBGC projects that they, in pretty short order, will be unable to pay guaranteed benefits, and we'll see a pretty massive reduction, absent congressional action, in participants' and retirees' benefits. So I wanted to get the conversation started with multi-employer plans. So maybe, Chris, do you want to kick it off, and then, Kara, you can chime in, too, on what's going on in Congress with multi-employer plans and how you see that playing out.
I don't want to talk about multi-employer.
Fair enough. Next subject.
I'm just kidding. Yeah, when I took the new position, I replaced Preston Rutledge. I think many of you have probably met in the past. I didn't realize that buried in one of the year-end fiscal reform packages was the multi-employer committee, so that kind of caught me off guard. And when I pointed it out to the chief of staff, he just pointed at me and said, "That's you." So notwithstanding all that, I've been working on this issue for a number of years, but as you all well know, we're beyond the critical stage with these programs, and there had been some legislation that had been kicking around the last couple of years after MEPRA to begin to address this issue, and rather than push those through, we came up with the classic DC approach to these things, which is let's set up another committee to look at this. But I have to tell you, it's a very serious effort. We, on the committee, are taking a real deep dive into understanding the legal framework around these plans, as well as all of the corollary issues that shape the situation that we're in now, from industrial changes to demographic changes that are affecting these plans, to financial market issues that relate to the investments in these programs. And as Kara will tell you, we're getting ready to go into a really heavy briefing schedule for staff and members, in addition to our public face, which is a series of hearings that we'll hold, one next week with Tom Reeder from PBGC, and then in June with a couple hearings from stakeholders. What we thought we would do in approaching this is need to educate the members of the committee pretty deeply on the issues, and so we have gone real down into the minutia on this stuff and are working our way through. At the same time, kind of behind the scenes, we're starting to look at a range of options to address this, and as experts in this field, you know the potential solutions here. Do you raise premiums for companies? Do you do some sort of benefit cut on the one side? Do you alter the asset side? Do you alter the liability side? That really shapes the argument in general. This is exceptionally difficult, and so in order to achieve anything that looks like a solution, we need to understand how the numbers all work out, both from a demographic and financial side. So we're marching our way through it. It is highly controversial, as you could expect, but my counterpart for Senator Brown, Gideon Bragen, and I are good friends. We have worked closely together on pension issues for many years, and we are trying to make this as free from politics at this point as possible. Once we have a core set of, or a common ground of information on these issues, then we will be able to begin discussing possible policy solutions here. And my only comment on that process at this point is all very sensitive, because if we were to release some ideas, there would be a lot of upset people. I can assure you of that. They're going to be, but my metric for success in this is if at the end of the day we come to a solution and everybody's mad at me, then I know we hit the balance just as closely as possible. So you all are experts in this area. If you have any ideas, if you have recommendations for people to come in and talk to us, if you want to come in and talk to us, we're just hoovering in as much information, data, and perspective on this as we can. I'd love to hear from you. So.
Great, thanks, Chris. And Kara, you know your boss has put a solution on the table. Maybe you can talk about a little bit about that and his interest in this issue.
Absolutely. Congressman Neal is very pleased to be a member of the Select Committee. Chris and Gideon have done a fantastic job. It's not so simple, as we found out, to even start a committee. Just it sounded like the administrative type things they had to go through, finding space and staff and whatnot has been definitely a headache. So we appreciate their leadership and their boss's leadership on the issue. I hope that there's a real opportunity here. It seems like all the members really are here in good faith. I've been attending the meetings and the hearings in good faith and really want to get to a solution here. It's a really tough issue, and it's not even a partisan issue. In some ways, I always describe the Maltese as kind of more of a regional issue. So depending on where you live, especially for the folks that happen to be living in the Midwest with central states, because these members, these senators, these members of Congress, they'll go to the grocery store and run into someone who's saying like, hey, you know, I worked my whole life. I did everything right. I participated in a pension plan, and now when I'm in retirement, I have no time to make up for lost time. My benefits might be cut. So there are no simple solutions here, and it's going to be very, very challenging. But it seems like, thanks to the leadership of Senator Hatch and Senator Brown and all of the members, that they really want to come together and try to find common ground here. So I'm hopeful, and we'll do everything we can. I know Mr. Neal says this is one of the most important tasks that he's had in his entire career. So they're certainly taking it very, very seriously. As Michael mentioned, Mr. Neal has legislation in this area. And we worked very closely with the companion bill is Senator Brown's. And essentially our bill is a loan program. And a lot of the programs out there, the ideas out there have shifted to kind of these loan ideas. UPS has their version of it. NCCMP has a version of it. Our version would have the government issuing bonds to bring in some money to do that, and then would provide loans essentially to very troubled plans and give them 30 years to pay back the loan, and hopefully help those plans really kind of get up and running again and give them some time to kind of fix the hole that they're in right now. We also have, the bill includes kind of a financial assistance part of it too, because we found when we were crunching the numbers that for certain plans they're so troubled that a loan wasn't enough, so we have that component of it as well. Our bill does not include any benefit cuts. We don't increase premiums on employers, the PBGC premiums. We wanted, at least, we felt as the starting point, that was a good place to start, because no one wants that. So we just at least wanted to show that it's at least possible to do that. We're spending a lot of time right now talking to the CBO because we have to get this scored and seeing what the cost is. There's a lot, as Chris and Michael both alluded to. This is a really complicated topic. You could have a pension attorney who's been working for 30 years who just happens to be in a single employer space that knows nothing about Maltese. So a lot of it, even just up on the Hill, I mean, forget the members, like even just educating the CBO on this issue. We're very fortunate. I know Chris has two, or on the select committee, we have two detailees from the PBDC. We're very lucky, Mr. Neal, and we did this early on, probably one of the smartest decisions I've ever made, because I do pensions, but I'm also the chief tax counsel for the Ways and Means Dems, and so especially with tax reform, I only have so much time, even though retirement is still my love, but I work on other issues too. So we also have a PBDC detailee who's very experienced in Maltese. So I think we're staffed up and we're ready, and so I would, as Chris mentioned, we'd welcome any feedback. Again, our bill was meant to just get an idea out there. We actually, it is a bipartisan bill in the House. We have, I think, 10 Republicans on the bill right now. And again, I really believe that this is an issue that members on both sides of the aisle want to address. It's a tough issue, and they know it's a tough issue. It's tough politically, it's tough substantively, but there seem to be a lot of members willing to work on it to get a solution. So I'm
yeah, and procedurally, right, Chris and Kara, that if this committee can reach a bipartisan majority consensus, there's a expedited process for the consideration of the legislative recommendations.
There's an expedited process in the Senate.
In the Senate.
I don't know the mysterious ways of the House.
Right.
Yeah, it was in the House, yeah.
So, yeah.
Great. So let's, speaking of tricky situations, let's pivot a little bit and talk about the DC system or the retirement system a little more generally. And in particular, you know, we read a lot of newspaper articles. We have a lot of discussions at forums like this about whether or not the system's doing enough to to encourage savings, whether more could be done, and in particular, are retirement plans covering enough people? And so I'd ask you all, maybe Kara, you can start with this, and then we'll go to Chris. Is there a coverage problem, and if so, what's the solution to it?
So at least the short answer from my perspective is yes, there is a coverage problem. And that's not to be necessarily critical of the system. My boss is a true believer in the employer retirement system, thinks it's been a huge success. And but there are limitations to no system is perfect, and one of the limitations is getting more people covered, especially those who work for small employers, and making it as easy as possible for small employers to provide an opportunity to save at work, because we've seen the success where those employees that are offered a retirement plan, the system has been quite successful for those folks. Mr. Neal has been a longtime champion of the auto IRA bill. I see Mark EBRI in the audience. That bill goes back over 10 years. It was a bipartisan effort to come together, the left and the right, on a solution to kind of address this issue. Unfortunately, and I put myself in this blaming category because I've been on the Hill the whole time, we at the federal level have not been able to get the bill over the finish line. So the states decided to go ahead and address the issue themselves, and so they used this model, and a number of the states have implemented state auto IRA programs, Oregon, California, Maryland, and others. And big proponents of what is happening in the states. I appreciate that they're took the initiative to try to address this issue and provide opportunities to save for their employees. That being said, I think from a policy perspective, I don't think it's necessarily the best system to have 50 state auto IRA systems if this trend continues. It would be better just to have a federal solution. And so that's where the federal auto IRA comes into place. Mr. Neal, this Congress has introduced a new concept, but is very similar to the auto IRA, but kind of what we've learned in terms of the auto IRA. Frankly, what we learned in terms of some of the criticism of the state auto IRA initiatives in terms of not allowing for ERISA coverage. So Neal now has introduced an auto 401k bill, but the same concept for employers that don't offer a retirement plan, that have more than 10 employees that have been in business for more than 3 years would be required to offer a 401k plan. The bill includes some relief from fiduciary responsibilities for employers that have less than 100 employees. There's tax credits, very similar to the auto IRA, to cover any expenses, although we really don't anticipate that there would be many expenses. There would be no requirement for employer contributions, but within this 401k system, employers could provide an employer contribution if they'd like. So Mr. Neal feels very strongly about this issue. He really does think that we need to address the coverage issue. And I'll conclude on this. I mean, looking at the politics, who knows what happens next Congress, but for the first time in a long time, it's not laughable to think that the House might flip. If the House flips, Mr. Neal would be the new chairman of the Ways and Means Committee, and I can assure you that retirement would be one of his big priorities. I was talking to him a couple months ago about it, and he was saying to me, Kara, this will be retirement will be the priority. And as someone, as a pension geek who's interested in this retirement stuff, I find that to be amazing, great, because for the first time, we really have, in a long time, a member that is really like this would be a top-tier issue. And so I think it's a nice opportunity for all of us that are interested in this retirement work to really do some interesting things. And so I will conclude that.
Great. Chris, maybe you can share some perspectives on the coverage issue generally and some potential solutions.
Okay, well, I always love doing a panel with Kara because it shows clearly that there's at least one policy space in D.C. where there's still good bipartisanship. In describing the new Neal bill, I love all those ideas. I agree there's a coverage problem. I also think there's some serious concerns about portability. We continue to need to work on leakage. We need to continue to make it easier for businesses to operate and manage these plans. And then one of the big ones that's emerging, and I know Kara's done some work on this as well, is gig workers, basically. So those are all on our plate looking forward, in addition to all the work that we're doing on the multi-employer side. But I couldn't agree more that we need to look at enhancing the system we have now, working to address coverage and access issues. There are a variety of ideas out there. I'm personally a big fan of the auto IRA idea. Auto enrollment, excuse me, I misspoke. And so I'm going to spend some time with you on the 401k concept. So, but I think it's important to keep in mind, and I'm really encouraged to hear that potential future Chairman Neal will make this a high priority issue, because it ensures me something to do next year after the multi-employer thing is over. But I'm really passionate about trying to address these core issues out there, and we'll continue to push forward on that. I don't know if you want me to. I mean, I can go on for hours on this if you want. But,
no, that's helpful, Chris. You mentioned. I'll dig in on one topic. You mentioned leakage. And that's, one thing we could do to encourage savings is ensure that people keep their money in the system. There's a considerable amount of money that trickles out every year. Leakage is the worst possible term we've created for any problem in the retirement space.
Yeah.
But, that's certainly an issue. I know
it depends. Oh, you caught that one.
That's when you're supposed to drop the mic and walk out. So in the private sector, we're seeing folks talk about auto portability and breaking down some of the barriers to allow the easier transfer and rollover of money between plans and between cash-out IRAs and plans. What is that something Congress wants to, at least your boss wants to take a crack at? Are there specific proposals on the table?
Oh yeah, absolutely. We take a look at. You're all very familiar with the RISA bill that we have out there now. We think that begins to address some of these issues in general.
For folks that aren't aware, it's the Retirement Enhancement and Savings Act, which was introduced and passed by Finance in 2016, I think originally on kind of a unanimous vote, and has now been reintroduced by Senator Hatch.
Yeah. So that gets there. I guess in that legislation there are about 4 major provisions. It's a cobbling together of a number of ideas that, frankly, not all of them came from Chairman Hatch. Most of them came from Mark. Actually, he seems to be the leader in most of this stuff. But in there we have an open MEPS concept, which we think will be a significant improvement to the system that will increase portability. We think it will enable smaller businesses and maybe, frankly, larger businesses. We're looking at some potential changes to it to bring in the larger employers as well. But we think that will improve coverage in general. It's not, as Kara noted, the end-all and be-all. One of my fundamentals in this space is we have an ever-changing economy. The retirement system writ large has to reflect that, and we're going to continually have to make changes and tweaks around the edges to make sure that we're doing all we can to make sure people have a range of options and good ability and an affordable ability to save for their future needs, basically. So we think Open MEPS does that. It's similar to the Neal bill, where we have thrown in an increase to the startup credit there, and we take a crack at some fiduciary relief in there within the context of the Open MEP process. One of the controversial provisions in the bill, frankly, is lifetime income disclosure. I'm sure many of you have heard about. We're continuing to work on that to see that we hit the mark there, that we reflect new technologies, that we're not locking people into one type of statement, that we allow companies and program administrators to have a range of options in how they do the disclosure. But fundamentally, we think that increasing disclosure to savers and participants is going to help them understand what their savings needs will be. So,
great, it's helpful.
Yeah, it was funny. In advance of coming here, Michael mentioned a few topics and that we may talk about, and leakage was one of them. And it got me thinking, because I really actually hadn't really been thinking about leakage a lot. When in a few jobs ago, I worked for Senator Cole, and he was very interested in the leakage issue. And in fact, in H.R. 1, the tax reform bill, a small provision related to when an employee is let go but has a loan, giving them a little more time to pay it back, was a part of that. And that was in Senator Cole's, it was one of Senator Cole's legislation. But I think we should do more on the leakage side on the Hill. I don't know if there are a tremendous amount of proposals right now. A lot of, and I see some familiar faces out there, a lot of great work has been done in the private sector, and I think that's amazing and should continue. And however we can help in that regard, please let us know. But I think we should be looking at the issue a little bit more. I mean, just when you look at the basics, it's a complicated, just thinking through it last night in preparation for coming here. In a lot of plans, especially a lot of the European plans, they just lock up the plan. You can't take the money out. But in our system where we have these voluntary contributions, you get nervous about kind of the lower income person, and if you want to incentivize them to save, and you want them to feel more comfortable, like maybe they save more if they know that if, God forbid, an emergency happens, they could access it. So it's a tough issue. I've always kind of seen both sides of it, but certainly we should do more. It's a problem, and people don't have enough savings right now. I mean, when you look at the statistics, especially with the shift away from DB plans, I get nervous when I think of the first 401k generation retiring and what that means for them, and I think leakage is a big part of it. But I think that's something that we as folks on the Hill should do more of, and I would certainly ask for your input in terms of specifics of what we should be doing.
Great. I'd love to open it up for questions, but let me pose one because I think everyone here otherwise is going to ask this question. You mentioned RISA. It's been reintroduced. Like I said, it passed finance in 2016 on a unanimous basis. What are the prospects that we see it passed in this Congress and in the Senate? And then, Kara, if it gets over to the House, what happens there?
well, if it doesn't pass the Senate, I get fired. So we had both the House and the Senate have some funky rules that you don't always see reviewed in the newspapers and articles about how we process legislation. In the Senate, we have this process called Hotline, which is basically you post a bill up on a special listserv, basically, and unless you receive an objection to it, then it moves through and is deemed passed by unanimous consent. And we have hotlined RISA and are hoping in the next couple of weeks that it will get through that process. It's gotten linked up to an extraneous issue that is a high priority for a certain senator, and I'm not really, it's a hold, so I'm not really at liberty to tell you who that is. But it's a pension-related bill that's important to a number of people, and we're trying to create a transaction where both of these pieces can go through together. Neither side of the transaction, it's kind of like a Clint Eastwood movie at the end where you had the two gunfighters standing out in the middle of the desert, and they're pointing their guns at each other, and the who puts their gun down first. It's really exactly like that. So I'm working with my counterparts in that particular office to try to get them to. I'll put my gun down. They'll put their gun down. What we're trying to do is force the bill into the House, and the legislation is fairly well supported over there. A number of Ways and Means members have the version over there, and we would like to try to press action on the bill. We can't control what the House does, but we think there is a potential. We have a little bit of leverage in how we're addressing this stuff to push the House into at least beginning to mark up something that looks similar to that.
And so, what are you hearing from the House?
The House, in some ways, I mean, Chris was talking about some of the Senate headaches with this. The House, I mean, we passed an omnibus bill a few weeks ago, and before that, we passed another spending bill. And there were very significant efforts to get RISA attached to those. And really, it was at the time, then this new Senate hiccup came up, but it really was the House was the problem. So I'm hopeful. It really is a shame. I have a long history with RISA, and it's Congress at its best. It reflects member priorities. It passed the Finance Committee 26-0, which is unprecedented. Will it transform the retirement system? No, but will it really significantly improve the retirement system? Yes. I mean, open MEPs, and Chris just went down the list of these really great provisions that are in this bill. So we need to get it over the finish line. It's a shame. All of this is like politics right now, and it really, unfortunately, shows that Congress sometimes is dysfunctional, and this is one instance. Unfortunately, when it comes to this year, there's just not a lot of opportunities left. A lot of people were calling that omnibus we passed a few weeks ago the last train leaving the station this year. There will be a potentially in September we have to do something on FAA, and so that provides us with a revenue vehicle. That's also a few weeks before an election, and an election that potentially one of the chambers may flip. So that might not be ideal in terms of getting bipartisan things done, but I think that's a vehicle. And then we'll also look at the lame duck, and maybe there are others. So there is interest, as Chris noted. Mr. Kelly has introduced RISA, the counterpart, over in the House. I think there's something like 7 Ways and Means Republicans on the bill. There's a lot of interest, so I think that's very, very positive. So I think it's just a matter of getting this thing over the finish line, but it's just not clear for this year. I do think it's clear that it will get done, but it's just hard. And so I feel like in some ways I was involved with the creation of RISA, but as the minority in the House, we're not as involved right now in terms of getting things moving. So it's really, I'm leaving it to Chris and Drew Crouch, who replaced me over in finance, and fingers crossed, and however we can be helpful. But then if it doesn't get done this year, which I hope it really does, then we'll have to see what the makeup is next year.
Great. Let's see if there's any questions. We'll open it up.
Hey, Michael.
We could take.
Just a quick question about the Booker-Young Commission. What's going on with that?
The Booker-Young Commission?
Yeah, the Retirement Commission that they proposed.
Oh, so Booker and Young have introduced Senators Booker and Young have introduced legislation to create a retirement commission. Chris, it's in your, I forget what committee it was referred to. I can't remember if it was Health or Finance, but it.
Goodness, I was aware that they had introduced the bill. I have to admit that, and I don't take this as a lack of interest. I've been so focused on the multi thing, I kind of lost track of where they are. In general, I think it's a very good idea. I'd have to look at the specifics of what they're actually proposing. The only downside I can think of anything like a commission is you write a big book and it gets put on a shelf and no one ever looks at it. So, but the more attention at a high level to all these issues, the better, I say.
Great. We can do one with David.
Sure. David Mitchell, Aspen Institute. Given the talk about kind of the balance between liquidity and leakage and locking things up, I was wondering if either of you had any reaction to the idea that I know we've talked about at EBRI before, and that Mark and others have talked about around a rainy day account, linking a kind of a sidecar rainy day account to the long-term 401k, and maybe being some deal there to be had where we lock up the long-term savings more stringently, but we allow people to kind of mentally account for short-term needs.
Yeah, I personally have always been interested and intrigued with that idea, and I've even explored it a little bit, just very preliminarily. I would recommend really talking to employers. I felt like when I started, because for example, if this type of account was associated with a 401k account, like the employers should have some say here, and I found a real lack of interest or even how it would work. So I was running into some roadblocks, and so then I'd always kind of put it aside. But certainly from personally, I think, and you raised the right issues, like Senator Wyden used to have this, there was some stat where like if they did some survey, and the average American, if their hot water heater broke, does not have enough money to fix it or replace it. And so something like that might be helpful, especially if there could be a little bit of employer money going into it as well. But I would recommend maybe trying to talk more to kind of employer groups, and but I can say honestly, from my perspective, I would certainly be interested if there was a little more meat to the idea. I think it's a good concept.
My only caveat about that is, and I think it is an idea that's very worth looking into, is I get a lot of requests from people for sidecars, anything that you can think of. And so I don't want to latch a whole lot on, I do have to admit being kind of a curmudgeonly Republican about some of this stuff. So, I don't want everybody, I don't want people to be able to defer all their income. You have to have some skin in the game, but a rainy day fund seems to be like a pretty good idea. Some of the other stuff out there is a bit outlandish, like being fat and out of shape. I don't really care about a sidecar to pay for your gym membership. So,
unacceptable.
Yeah, sorry.
Yeah. Well, these guys have to get back to the Hill, so I'm going to wrap it up there. But thank you both so much for joining us.
Thanks to Michael as well.
And I apologize for my crass joke about leakage.
Thank you all very much. Just take a couple of minutes here to wrap things up. I hope you guys found some value in the debates and the conversations and the questions being posed, and hopefully a few answers being given throughout the morning this morning. Look for your feedback. I'd love to see it. We all want to build these forums moving forward to be more and more engaging and compelling. So I have signed on to help Lori as the vice chair and help Josh in the research committee, focusing on research around policy and delivering it via these forums. We plan to continue to do these on a semi-annual basis. So I think in final closing, Lori, you wanted to come up and make a couple comments?
Thank you, Michael. And I did want to give special thanks to the folks that put this together. It was a different initiative this year. We had Michael, who was the vice chair of this policy forum planning committee, and Tom Johnson, Neil Lloyd, Josh Cohen, Mike Skinner, Chris Holtmeyer, and Jake Biscaglia were kind of pivotal in this, but there was a whole cast of others that were very instrumental in getting this done as well. So I wanted to give special thanks to everyone who put this together, and remind you that this has been live streamed, and there will be a recording available hopefully later today if you want to send a note to your colleagues to take a look. And then we will be having our next policy forum coming up in December 13th. Mark your calendar, and we will have a save the date coming out shortly. But thank you very much for joining us. We very much appreciate it.